The trauma bay Dordwood Mercy Medical Center didn't open. They exploded inward. A 90-pound Belgian Malinois with a torn cornea and 3 years of battlefield conditioning planted himself over a body bag and dared anyone to come closer. Armed soldiers froze. A colonel barked orders that went nowhere. And then a nurse in blue scrubs walked past all of them, crouched down in the blood, and said 4 words to a dog that hadn't let anyone within 6 feet of his dead handler. The room stopped breathing, the dog stopped growling. Nobody in that trauma bay could explain what just happened except the nurse. And she wasn't talking. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're exactly where I want you. Follow this channel. So you don't miss a single part, hit like if you're staying till the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most Tuesdays started at Redwood Mercy, slow, then suddenly not. Mara Bennett was 41 minutes internal lead when incoming military transport, trauma classification 2, 1 KIA, 1 K9 unit in distress. The charge nurse had relayed it with the flat voice. People develop after too many years of bad news, and Mara had simply nodded, finished drawing the blood culture she was in the middle of, and walked toward the bay. She was not the trauma team lead. That was Dr. Phillips, who went by Phil and wore the same brand of shoe for 11 years, because he'd decided some things weren't worth reconsidering. She was not the department supervisor. That was Claudette Marsh, who had opinions about everything from IV placement to the temperature of the break room, and was not shy about sharing them. Mara was by the official reckoning of Redwood Mercy Medical Center, a level 2 trauma nurse with 7 years of civilian service, a record of no formal complaints, and a personnel file that the HR coordinator once described as aggressively unremarkable. She had worked hard to keep it that way. The transport came in fast, 2 military vehicles pulling into the ambulance bay with the kind of deliberate speed that meant people inside them had already made decisions and expected the world to accommodate. I watched from the edge of the bay as the doors opened. Soldiers in ACUs. A 5th in officer's insignia who was doing the thing officers do, scanning the room before entering it, assigning threat levels to the furniture. Behind them, a handler's bag, and then the sound low, stained. Not quite a growl, more like a frequency the body registers before the ears do. Came out last, and Mara felt her breath catch. He was a Belgian Malinois, the kind of dog that looks like someone engineered an animal specifically for the purpose of controlled violence, and then forgot to install an off switch. Left eye was clouded, completely old injury, the kind that had scarred over and settled, and his right was tracking everything in the room with an intensity that made the orderly near the supply cabinet take 2 involuntary steps backward. His harness was standard military issue, but worn unevenly, the left strap fraying where he'd been pulling hard against it. He was favoring his right front paw, and he was positioned over the body bag on the gurney, with the absolute conviction of something that had already decided. This was the last decision it would ever make. Get the animal secured, the officer said. He had colonel's insignia and the voice of someone who'd spent a long time being listened to. His name tag read. Cross, sir, we've been trying. One of the younger soldiers started. I didn't ask for context. I asked for the animal secured. Mara had already moved to the left side of the bay, angling herself into a position where she could see the dog's weight distribution. She wasn't doing it consciously. Some habits don't ask permission before they start. The dog's name was on his harness tag decker. She filed it without reacting. Dr. Phillips arrived with the kind of energy that people call competent, and Mara privately called nervous but functional. Colonel, I'm Dr. Philip Hargrove. I'm the trauma team lead. We're going to need to move the deceased to processing. Can your team assist in relocating the dog? That's what we're attempting, Cross said, and there was something in the word attempting that he did not enjoy saying. 2 soldiers moved toward Decker. Mara watched the dog's weight shift, watched his head lower, watched the specific angle of his shoulders, which was not aggression not yet, but was something much more specific, something she recognized from a context she did not discuss at work. He isn't attacking you, she said. Several heads turned. Colonel Cross turned last, the way people do when they've assessed something as a distraction and are only now reconsidering. He's protecting him, Mara said. The positioning. He's not guarding territory. He's guarding a person. There's a difference in how they weight their stance. If your soldiers move toward the bag rather than away from the dog, he's going to interpret that as I am. Cross said it with the kind of precise flatness that isn't rudeness but is very much not politeness. I appreciate your input. Please step back. Mara did not step back. She also didn't step forward. She stood where she was, which was a very specific kind of non-compliance. Dog. is favoring his right front paw, she said. As if he lunges, which he will. If you don't change your approach, he's going to land on that paw wrong, and you're going to have a 90-pound animal in acute pain in a trauma bay. Sergeant Kowalski, Cross said. The larger of the two soldiers moved toward Decker with a leash attachment, and the confidence of someone who had done this before. Decker moved faster. It wasn't a lunge, not quite. It was a pivot and a snap that happened before Kowalski had finished extending his arm, and the sound of it, the clack of teeth on empty air, close enough to register as contact sent Kowalski stumbling back into the equipment cart. Trace hit the floor. Someone swore Decker, returned to his position over the bag with the mechanical efficiency of a system. Rebooting eyes, tracking every person in the room, body completely still. Stared at Mara. Mara looked at the dog. I'll need the room a little quieter, she said. And your people need to move back, all of them, including you. There was a silence that had several competing textures in it. Then, and Cross said slowly, excuse me, not permanently. Just give me 12 feet and 30 seconds. If it doesn't work, you can do whatever you were going to do. She paused. But it's going to work. She didn't wait for his answer. She crouched down to the floor, not fast, not dramatically, just down, like she had all the time in the world and no particular opinion about being at dog level, and she started talking to the room, to Decker. Her voice dropped below the ambient noise of the hospital entirely. The words weren't important. What was important was the rhythm, even unhurried, with a specific cadence that the room couldn't quite parse. She wasn't soothing him, she was orienting him. There was a difference, and it was not a small one. Decker's ears moved. The low sound stopped. His right paw, the one he'd been favoring, shifted. Then, slowly, with the visible reluctance of something that had decided this against every instinct it owned, he took one step toward her. Bay. Collectively, did not breathe. Mara let him come to her. Didn't reach for him. Didn't make contact. Let him investigate her wrist the way he needed to, with his head lowered and his clouded left eye turned toward her, and she just stayed there on the floor, completely unbothered by the fact that there were 12 people staring at her, and a colonel trying to decide if he was furious or impressed. Decker pressed his nose against her wrist and held it there for 3 full seconds. Then he sat down. The room exhaled. Okay, Mara said, still at floor level. Let's look at that paw. What happened next should have been straightforward. It wasn't. Because Claudette Marsh arrived. Claudette had many qualities that made her effective as a department supervisor. Attention to protocol was one of them. Flexibility was not, and the sight of Mara Bennett sitting cross-legged on the trauma bay floor with a military working dog's injured paw in her lap, while a colonel and 4 soldiers stood in a semicircle. Watching was not a sight. Claudette was prepared to file under any category she recognized. Her voice had the specific register of someone choosing their words very carefully, because a more accurate word selection would be inappropriate in mixed company. For you doing secondary wound assessment. He's got debris in the pad, looks like it's been there a few days. There's some early stage infection. You are a trauma nurse. I'm aware for humans. The wound care principles transfer more than people think. Claudette looked at Colonel Cross with the expression of someone seeking an allied power and finding the situation more complicated than expected. Cross, for his part, was watching Mara work with an expression. She couldn't entirely read, part assessment, part something more careful. She's not authorized to be treating that animal, said, directing this at Cross now. Right. And frankly, she interfered with your team's attempt to secure him. I want. It's noted, Cross said without specifying in whose favor. Removed a fragment of embedded material from Decker's paw pad. Something dark, possibly gravel, possibly something harder, and Decker flinched once, a full body shudder, and then held still again. She murmured something to him that nobody in the room could hear. Settled. The infection is manageable if it's treated now, Mara said, still not looking up. But whoever's been responsible for his care for the past few days hasn't been cleaning the wound. If he'd had to put full weight on this during whatever your team was attempting, he'd have gone down, and a panicked MWD in a closed space with medical equipment and civilians is a bad combination. He's been in transport, Cross said, 48 hours. Looked up for the first time. 48 hours from where? The question sat in the air for a moment too long. That's not relevant to your assessment, Cross said. It'd be relevant to his. She held Cross's gaze for a beat. How long was he with the handler before the handler died? Another pause. Longer this time, Sergeant First Class Aldrich Voss, Cross said, and the name had the weight of something that had already been hard to say. 2 months together. Decker was his first assignment out of the program. Mara nodded once. She already knew from Decker's behavior that the bond had been long and tight, but the confirmation settled something in her understanding of the room. She wrapped the paw with what she had available. It wasn't perfect. It was trauma-based stock, not a vet's kit, but it was snuff and stood up slowly so as not to startle him. Decker stood with her. Cross, watch this. Where did you learn to handle military dogs? And Mara began pulling off her gloves' online resources. Animal behavior is interesting. It was the most unconvincing thing she'd said all morning, and from the look on Cross's face he knew it. Claudette, however, was focused on a different problem. I need a word outside. Outside meant the hallway adjacent to the bay, just far enough from the door to allow the fiction of privacy. Claudette folded her arms and kept her voice low in the way that supervisors learn to do when they want to convey the full weight of their institutional authority without creating a scene. I don't know what that was, Claudette said, but I need you to understand that intervening in a military transfer, handling a military working dog without authorization, contradicting a colonel in his face, though it's not things I can protect you from if he decides to make it a problem. I wasn't asking you to protect me. I'm aware you never ask anyone for anything which is its own problem. Claudette rubbed the bridge of her nose. You're good at your job, Mara. You're one of the best I have. But there's something going on with you today that I don't understand, and I don't like operating in the dark. I saw that the dog was injured and in distress, and that the approach being used was going to make the situation worse. I addressed it. You didn't just address it. You walked into the middle of a military operation like you'd done it before. Mara said nothing. Have you? Claudette asked. Done something like that before? The hallway was not quiet. Hospitals are never quiet, but there was a particular quality to the silence that Mara let sit between them. Then she said, I'm going to go check on my other patients. Claudette. Her voice was even not unkind. Finished. I heard what you said. I'll be more careful. She walked back toward the main ward without hurrying, without looking back, and without giving any external indication of what was happening behind her face, which was something she'd gotten very good at. She was halfway down the hall when she heard boots behind her, at Claudette's heels, something heavier, with the deliberate rhythm of someone who covered ground for a living. She kept walking. Miss Bennett crossed. She stopped, turned. He was alone, which meant he'd left his team with the dog, which meant either he trusted them more than he'd appeared to, or he wanted this conversation to stay small. Colonel, I'm going to ask you something directly, he said, and I'd appreciate a direct answer, even if the answer is that you'd rather not say. She waited. You told my sergeant. The dog was in a protective stance, not an aggressive one. That's a distinction. Most people, including people trained to work with military dogs, miss in the moment. You knew it immediately. He paused. You also used a verbal orientation protocol that I've only seen deployed in 2 training contexts, both of which are above civilian access. I considered him. He was probably 50, had the kind of face that had been weathered rather than aged, and was looking at her with the specific attention of someone who was used to gathering information from what people didn't say. You're very observant, she said. Occupational hazard. He didn't smile. Are you going to make me run your name through channels, or are you going to save us both some time? Running my name through channels seems like it's going to take more of your time than you have right now, she said. You have a KIA to process, a traumatized MWD, with a paw infection that needs proper vet care in the next 24 hours. And she paused because she'd been trying not to say this and had decided it wasn't something she could stay quiet about. And something about the way Sergeant Voss came in doesn't fit a standard field fatality. The transfer documentation I saw on the gurney listed cause of death as cardiac event. Voss was what 3032 Cross's face did something very small and very controlled. That information isn't for civilian personnel. I know. She held his gaze. I'm telling you what I noticed. What you do with it is your business. She turned and walked away before he could respond. This time he didn't follow. Mara's remaining patients that morning were the kind of cases that should have had her full attention. A construction worker with a hand injury that was going to need a surgical consult. A 17-year-old with a dislocated shoulder from a car accident. An elderly man with chest pain that was probably anxiety, but might not be. She moved through all of them with the competence and presence that had made her genuinely good at this job, because she hadn't been faking that part, but some portion of her mind had stayed in the trauma bay. Not because of the dog. She'd learned in a different life not to get attached to them. Not because of Cross, who was perceptive, but ultimately just another officer doing his job. Because of the transfer documentation. Because of what she'd seen on that gurney tag in the 3 seconds she'd had to look at it while crouching to assess Decker. Voss. age 31, theater of Operation Verdacta. Cause of death, cardiac event. Off transfer authorization, Owen Bexley. Hospital administrator, Edward Mercy Medical Center. That last line was the one she couldn't let go of. Transfer. Authorization wasn't a medical determination. It was an administrative approval to move the body through the facility and into military custody. Hospital administrators signed those forms. It was routine. There was nothing inherently wrong with Rowan Bexley's name being on that form. Except that Voss had come through the trauma bay. Standard protocol for a military KIA was a civilian says surgical review, documentation of injuries, coroner notification. None of that had happened. The form on the gurney had been pre-signed. The body had been brought in and was already being moved out. The only reason the process had slowed down was Decker. Found a quiet moment near the end of her afternoon tasks and pulled up the facility's internal scheduling system, not patient records. Nothing she didn't have clearance for, just the daily operations log. Voss's transport was listed arrival time bay assignment handling team. But there was no surgical consult log, no coroner notification. The processing notation read expedited transfer authorization RB. Rowan Bexley. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she logged out and went back to work. The thing about Mara Bennett was that she had, over the course of 7 years, become very good at not standing out. This hadn't always been a skill. There had been a period of her life when standing out had been not just accepted, but operationally necessary when her ability to be noticed, to command attention and resources in high-pressure environments, had been part of what she was paid to do. But that period had ended badly in the classified way that certain careers end, and she had come to Redwood Mercy with a new name on her nursing license, a background that was real but selectively curated, and a clear internal policy about how much of herself she was willing to let any of this touch. That policy was currently under significant stress. 4. In the afternoon, she had heard through the department's informal communication network, which operated primarily through the ward clerk, a woman named Bev, who had the information distribution capabilities of a small newspaper, that the military team was still in the facility. Colonel Cross had been in a closed meeting with Rowan Bexley for 40 minutes. That Decker had been moved to a supply room at the end of the east corridor, which was where they put things they weren't sure what to do with. That clocked out at 5:15, changed out of her scrubs, and walked in the direction of her car. She made it to the east corridor. Decker heard her before she opened the door. She could hear him shift the specific sound of an alert dog, adjusting his position, not aggressive, just aware. She pushed the door open slowly, announced herself with a low sound before entering the way she'd been trained to do an eternity ago, and found him exactly where she'd expected, in the corner, curled in the way dogs curl when they're exhausted, but can't sleep, facing the door. He looked at her, his clouded left eye caught the overhead light, and for a second he looked like something out of a dream, ancient and patient and completely alone. Hunson, she sat down on the floor. She hadn't brought anything, no food, no equipment, just herself. She wasn't sure why she'd come, except that she knew, in the way she knew things that she'd spent years learning to know, that leaving him alone in this room was something she wasn't going to do. Watched her for a long time. Then, because he had already decided about her in the trauma bay, and dogs don't change their minds the way people do, he put his head down on the floor near her knee and closed his good eye. Sat in the dark and did not think about Aldrich Voss's transfer documentation, and did not think about Rowan Bexley's name on a pre-signed form, and did not think about the 6-year-old memory of a classified operation that had ended her first career, and the specific chain of decisions that had led from there to here. She didn't think about any of it. She just sat with the dog while the hospital moved around them. 30 minutes later, the door opened. Cross stood in the doorway, looking at her on the floor with the dog's head near her knee, and he said, "I ran your name through channels." Kept her voice even. He was quiet for a moment. "The public record says you've been a civilian nurse for 7 years. No complaints, no gaps, that's accurate." "On public record," he said, "has a very large block of redacted material. 3 letters of classification I haven't seen used for a nurse before. And a note from a department that doesn't officially exist, saying that if I pursue this inquiry further, I should call a number I'm not going to repeat in a hospital hallway." The room was very quiet. "I called the number," Cross said. I looked at him. "They told me," he said carefully, "that the person I was asking about had completed her service and her records were sealed for operational reasons, and that further inquiry would require a formal request with a 30-day processing window." He paused. "They also told me off the record that I should trust her." Baker's breathing had the even rhythm of something finally genuinely resting. Owen. Bexley signed Voss's transfer before the body arrived, Mara said. The form was predated. There's no surgical review logged, no coroner notification, and the cause of death on that gurney tag doesn't match the age and profile of the soldier. Voss leaned against the doorframe. His face had gone very still. I'm not making an accusation, she said. I'm telling you what I saw, same as before. You can do whatever you want with it. If you're right, Cross said. Slowly, then someone inside this KIA, outside of standard protocol, using administrative authority to rush a body through before anyone could look at it. Us. And if I pull that thread, it's going to be inconvenient for someone, Mara said. Probably someone with more institutional leverage than either of us. Cross was quiet for a long moment, looking at her and the dog, and the whole strange tableau of the thing. Then he straightened up. I need to make some calls. Don't go anywhere. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Sitting with the dog, he left the door eased shut behind him. Becker didn't stir. Stayed where she was in the dim supply room that smelled of antiseptic and old equipment, and stared at the middle distance and turned over in her mind, very carefully, the way you handle something that has edges, the question of who exactly had known that Aldrich Voss was going to die before his body had ever left the field. She had been in this building for 7 years without being found, being looked for, without anything from the life before reaching across the gap and pulling at the edges of the life she'd rebuilt. Owen. Bexley had signed that form. She didn't know yet what that meant. But downstairs in the administrator's office, a man who had approved an expedited military transfer was sitting in a closed-door meeting with a colonel who was now asking questions he hadn't been asking 2 hours ago. And somewhere in the hospital's record system, buried under administrative approvals and scheduling logs, was documentation that told a story. Mara wasn't sure yet whose story it was, but she was absolutely sure of one thing. It wasn't the one on the gurney tag. And when Bexley found out that the questions had started, which he would, because hospitals leaked like sieves and he clearly had people listening, he was going to do something about it. People who pre-signed transfer forms for military casualties did not wait quietly to see how things developed. The real question was whether he'd come for the paperwork first, or whether he'd already figured out that the only living witness who couldn't be managed was not in fact the colonel with the classified clearances. It was the dog. Decker twitched in his sleep, one ear rotating toward some sound she couldn't hear and then settled again. The tags on his harness caught the light, the handler's tags, she realized. He was still wearing Voss's tags. Someone had threaded them through the harness loop. That had been done deliberately or by accident, or by someone who understood that a dog cannot be told his handler is gone and so must be allowed to carry him instead. She didn't know. She reached out very carefully and touched the tag with one finger. Aldrich KSFC Oneg. She pulled her hand back. With what she knew and what she didn't know, and the specific familiar weight of being the person in the room who could see what others couldn't and still had to decide what to do about it. Outside the supply room, the hospital shifted into its evening rhythm. On the hall, a door opened and closed. Footsteps moved in the direction of the administrator's wing, quick and purposeful. 2 sets of them, then 3. Mara listened. The footsteps stopped somewhere they shouldn't have. The footsteps stopped somewhere. They shouldn't have, not at the nurse's station, not at the staff elevator, but at the records alcove 2 doors down, the one that housed the physical filing backup for Trauma Bay documentation. System, mostly unused since they'd migrated to digital 4 years ago. Knew it was there, because she'd once had to pull a paper chart from it during a server outage. She knew, more importantly, that it was not a place anyone went at 6:15 in the evening without a specific reason. She heard the distinct sound of a drawer being opened. Becker's ear rotated again. His good eye open. Mara was already on her feet. She didn't go toward the sound. She went in the opposite direction, out the supply room door and around the long way through the east corridor junction and into the main hall from the far end, which gave her a sightline to the records alcove without putting herself directly in anyone's path. She moved the way she'd learned to move in spaces. She didn't control, with the unhurried gait of someone who belonged there. A woman in civilian clothes at the end of a shift, heading toward nothing in particular. 2 men were at the alcove. One, she didn't recognize, hospital security uniform, older, the kind of posh that sets law enforcement, but a long time ago. The other was Marcus Priel, Bexley's personal administrative coordinator, who Mara knew by sight from the weekly department memo and from the particular way he'd looked through her at 3 different all-staff meetings, as though she were part of the background. Had a folder in his hand. He was sliding it into a bag. Eyes. The security guard was watching the hallway. He saw Mara. Athens. She kept walking normal pace, didn't make eye contact, didn't slow down, just continued toward the stereotypical exit like a woman whose shift had ended and who wanted nothing more complicated than a parking garage and a car. Behind her, she heard the alcove drawer slide shut. She pushed through the stairwell door and stood on the landing and did not move for 10 full seconds, listening. The door didn't open behind her. She exhaled once, slow and controlled, then pulled out her phone. Boss had given her his direct line, not voluntarily, but she'd read it off the card he'd set on the gurney frame when he'd been talking to Phillips, and she had the kind of memory that collected information it would need later, without being asked to. He picked up on the second ring cross. They're pulling physical documents from the Trauma Bay backup archive, she said. An administrative coordinator named Priel plus a security guard. I don't recognize. I've got a bag of paws. How long ago? I walked past them 90 seconds ago. They may still be there. Don't go back, I know. I mean it, Bennett. I know, she said again, which was not a promise. Do you have anyone in the building? I have Sergeant Kowalski and 2 others. They're with the transport vehicle. Get someone to the East Corridor Records alcove. Physical, not digital. They're not touching the servers. They're pulling paper backup. She heard him relaying the order to someone, his voice dropping into the clipped efficiency of a man operating on a timeline. Then he came back. Where are you? East stairwell, 2nd floor. Air. She did not stay there. What she did was go back up to the supply room, because Decker was in that room, and Decker was, she understood this now in a way that felt like responsibility, rather than sentiment, the most inconvenient piece of evidence in the building. He had been with Voss for 22 months. He had been present at whatever happened. A military working dog who survived a handler's death in a non-combat context was a witness in the only form that couldn't be debriefed, couldn't be coerced, and couldn't sign a non-disclosure form. He couldn't tell anyone what he knew, but he could prove he'd been there, which was apparently enough to make him a problem. She pushed the supply room door open. Decker was standing alert, the relaxed posture of 10 minutes ago completely gone. Athens. He was looking at the door with his good eye, and his body was angled away from the wall, weight forward in the ready configuration she recognized. He'd heard something she hadn't. Easy, she said, in the low even register she'd used in the trauma bay. I'm here. He looked at her, looked at the door. Back. She put herself between him and the door. Whatever he'd heard, she hadn't. And maybe it was nothing a hospital. At evening, shift change was full of sounds that could pattern match to threat if you were a dog who'd spent 3 years in active theater. But she'd learned to take seriously the things that dogs paid attention to that people missed, and Decker was not a dog who overreacted. She was still standing there working through her options when the supply room door opened from the outside. It wasn't Priel. It wasn't the security guard. It was a man she'd never seen before in street clothes, with the kind of build and the kind of eyes that told her immediately that he was not hospital staff. He was carrying a tranquilizer syringe, which he was not making any effort to conceal, and he was looking at Decker with the expression of someone who had been given a task and intended to complete it efficiently. Decker went absolutely rigid. Ma'am, you need to step aside, the man said. No, Mara said. She said it the way she said most things, evenly, without inflection, without making it a confrontation or a question. Just a fact she was delivering. The man looked at her properly for the first time, reassessing. People who showed up in hospital supply rooms to tranquilize military dogs did not typically encounter nurses who said no like they meant it and didn't move. This is a veterinary sedation procedure authorized by the hospital administration, he said. Dog needs to be transported for care. You're not a vet, Mara said. That's not a veterinary formulation. She'd seen the label on the syringe in the 2 seconds she'd had to read it. And you came through the door without knocking, which tells me you didn't expect to find anyone in here. Beat, step aside, he said again. I'm going to suggest, Mara said, that you leave this room and make a different decision. Because the colonel who's currently on the phone with people above your pay grade is going to have felt personal in this approximately. She glanced at nothing, making the calculation sound exact 4 minutes. And whatever you were paid to do tonight is not going to be worth the conversation that follows. Watched him work through it. Watched the specific micro-expression of someone doing risk math in real time. And Decker made a sound, not a bark, not quite a growl. Something lower and more deliberate from the back of his chest that landed in the room like a statement. And Mara closed the door, leaned against it, and allowed herself to shake for exactly 3 seconds. That was the amount of time she'd decided at some point in a different life was the acceptable window for physiological response to high-stress situations. Right. Then she stopped, straightened, and took out her phone again. Boss. Didn't pick up this time. She left a message. Someone just tried to tranquilize the dog. My room. Second floor east, I handled it. But you should know. She looked at Decker. He was watching her with the quiet attentiveness she was coming to recognize as his default mode, not anxious, just present. Okay, she said to him very quietly. We need to move getting a 90-pound Belgian Malinois with a wrapped paw and a compromised eye through a hospital without being stopped required a specific kind of focused improvisation. Aya had worked in this building for 7 years. She knew which corridors had cameras on broken schedules, which stairwells were used by maintenance and therefore unlikely to have administrative staff, and which service entrance remained propped from 3 in the afternoon until the evening kitchen delivery was complete. She used all of that. Decker moved with her in the way that well-trained working handlers, not because he'd been commanded to, but because he'd assessed her and made his own determination. The paw slowed him, but only a little. He was toughing it out in the way that dogs tough things out, which is to say completely, without drama, leaving it to humans to notice. She got them to the service entrance and stopped. The evening air came in through the prop door. Decker lifted his nose to it. Not yet, she said. She couldn't take him out without knowing where Cross's team was, and she couldn't contact Cross's team without knowing where Cross was, and Cross wasn't picking up his phone. She stood at the edge of the door in the smell of the evening and loading dock exhaust and thought about her next move. Her next move walked toward her in the form of Sergeant Kowalski, who appeared at the end of the service lane with 2 other soldiers and looked extremely relieved to see the dog and somewhat alarmed to see Mara. He was slightly out of breath. Colonel Cross sent us. He said he looked at Decker. You moved him. Someone came to the supply room with a tranquilizer, Mara said. I thought. A change of location was appropriate. Kowalski stared at her. How did you as the colonel in the building? He's with the administrator. Kowalski's jaw tightened. Got loud. How loud? The administrator called the hospital's legal team. Us called JG. Colonel told us to find you and the dog, and not let anyone near either of you. She registered the anyone near either of you, so Cross had connected the same dots she had, that the attempt on Decker wasn't opportunistic, that someone had decided the dog was a liability specific enough to be worth eliminating tonight. Before whatever was happening upstairs could escalate further. What did they find in the records alcove? She asked. Kowalski glanced at the 2 soldiers behind him, the slight hesitation of someone calculating clearance levels. Then he seemed to decide your Colonel Dr. Hargrove. He caught Priel leaving the building with a bag. Turned him back at the parking structure exit. The bag had physical intake forms and something else, a printed authorization chain for the body transfer. It's got signatures on it that don't line up with the timeline. Mara went still. What kind of don't line up? The authorization to transfer Sergeant Voss was signed 3 hours before his transport arrived at this facility. Kowalski said it carefully. The way you say things, you haven't fully processed yet. 3 hours. The hospital's own timestamp is on the form. A form pre-signed before the body arrived. She'd suspected the form was wrong, but she'd assumed predated by a matter of minutes, the kind of clerical violation that could theoretically be attributed to administrative sloppiness. 3 hours was not sloppiness. 3 hours was someone who knew Voss was going to die before he'd been declared dead. She leaned against the doorframe. The evening light was going thin and orange over the service lane. Where's Priel now? She asked. Building security has some Cross's order. Hospital legal is contesting the detention. Hospital legal, Wood Mara said. Administrator Bexley is claiming it's a civilian jurisdiction issue. The colonel doesn't have authority to detain a civilian employee on hospital property. Kowalski's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. Colonel Cross is explaining why he disagrees. Mara looked at Decker. Doing the calm, alert thing that she'd come to understand was not calmness, but rather a form of controlled readiness. He was managing himself. She wondered, not for the first time, what he understood about what was happening. Dogs didn't grieve the way humans did, but they tracked the absence of things with a precision that humans rarely matched. He knew Voss wasn't there. He'd known it in the trauma bay. Whatever he was doing now, staying close to her, tolerating the strangers, holding himself together, it was a kind of choice. She understood choosing to hold yourself together. Take us to Cross, she said. The office was on the 3rd floor corner suite, the kind of space that communicated importance through square footage. By the time Mara got there with Kowalski's team and Decker, it was not a quiet space. Ross was standing near the window. Bexley was behind his desk in the posture of a man who'd decided that the desk was a form of protection. A woman in a charcoal suit who was clearly the legal representation stood to Bexley's left with the expression of someone doing extensive real-time damage assessment. 2 hospital security personnel stood in the background trying to look neutral. Bexley's eyes went to Decker when they entered, and something moved behind them that Mara filed carefully. This is completely unacceptable, the lawyer said. Cross. You have no authority. I have a deceased U.S. Army Sergeant First Class, whose transfer documentation was pre-authorized by this facility before he was declared dead, Cross said. His voice was the flattest she'd heard it. That is not a civilian jurisdiction matter. That is a federal criminal matter. The timing discrepancy on that document is a clerical. 3 hours, Cross said. 3 hours before the transport arrived. 5. Before any communication from the field reached this facility. Often is time-stamped by your own system. Explain the clerical error that produces a signature 3 hours before the signee had any information to sign about. Silence. Mara came fully into the room, and Bexley's gaze tracked from Decker to her, and she watched him reassemble something behind his face. He was a man in his 50s, who had the groomed look of some operated comfortably in institutional power for a long time, visibly afraid. Recalibrating Ms. Bennett, he said. You were advised this afternoon to limit your interaction with the military transfer. I was, she said, and yet here you are. Here I am, she agreed. You're out of your scope. You have no standing in this conversation. She's here at my request, Cross said without looking away from the window. Bexley shifted his attention between them, with the expression of a man who has suddenly understood that 2 people in the room have been talking to each other, and he didn't know it. It reorganized his assessment of the situation. She watched it happen. The transfer documentation can be reviewed by appropriate parties through appropriate channels, the lawyer said, finding her footing. Any irregularities will be addressed through the hospital's compliance. Hospital's compliance office reports to Mr. Bexley, Mara said. Ayer looked at her. That's not an opinion, Mara continued. It's in your organizational chart, which means the appropriate internal channel runs directly through the person whose signature is on the document in question. She paused. So when you say appropriate channels, I want to make sure we're all being specific about what that means in this facility's structure. Bexley's lawyer opened her mouth and then closed it. Bexley said nothing. Cross turned from the window. I've requested a federal review team. They'll be here within the hour. At that point, this becomes their jurisdiction entirely, and I'm happy to let them run it. He looked at Bexley. In the meantime, I've asked the facility's IT security to place a hold on the record systems, physical and digital, pending the review. You had no authority to do that without a court order, the lawyer said. The facility's IT director disagreed. Cross's tone made it clear that this distinction was intentional. Apparently she had some concerns of her own. Bexley stood up abruptly. This is harassment. This is a military officer using institutional intimidation against a civilian administrator who is trying to operate a facility under significant shutdown, Cross said. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said it, and the weight of it landed in the room like something physical, and Bexley stopped. Not because he was afraid exactly, because the man who'd said it had clearly been in rooms where far more serious things were being decided and had never once considered raising his voice to accomplish them. Bexley sat down. In the silence that followed, Decker made a sound. It's very small. Not alps to vocalization, the kind of sound a dog makes when something in the room has changed and he's acknowledging it. Several people looked at him. He was looking at Bexley with the specific directness of a dog who has decided about someone. Mara did not look at Decker. She was looking at Bexley, and she was watching the thing that his face did when the dog made that sound, which was the thing she'd been waiting to understand since she'd walked into this room. It was not guilt exactly. It was the expression of a man who had known in some operational sense about this dog, who had factored him into a plan and was now confronting the specific miscalculation of having underestimated what that meant. When did you first know about Sergeant Voss's unit? She asked. Ayer said. I'm not asking you, Mara said, keeping her eyes on Bexley. I'm asking him. Bexley said nothing. The form was pre-signed 3 hours early, she said. Hackers. Someone told you the transfer was coming before the field had even made the notification. That means you had a source inside the operation or inside the system that was supposed to be processing it. She lets it sit. I'm not law enforcement. I'm not recording anything. I'm a nurse who spent 7 years in this building and 6 years before that doing something I'm not going to specify, and I'm telling you, as a professional observation, that you look like a man who made a calculation and is realizing the calculation was wrong. Lee looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Decker again. Ives. The dog shouldn't be in this room, he said. That's not appropriate. Cross said. Something shifted in Bexley's face. Resolution, not confession. Something more like a wall developing a crack that he was trying to hold together manually while deciding his next move. Ayer put a hand on his arm and he shook it off. Office door opened. Dr. Phillips appeared slightly out of breath, holding a tablet. Athens. Colonel Cross, the Federal Review team, just checked in. They're 15 minutes out. And there's something else. He looked at Mara. Beeve pulled the server-side intake logs. The deletion isn't clean, Mara went still. Someone deleted intake documentation from Voss's record between 3 and 4 this afternoon, Phillips said. T says the deletion was improperly executed. The files were removed from the active system, but the backup partition wasn't fully scrubbed. Metadata is still there. File names, timestamps, the user credentials of whoever made the deletions. Types. Turned the tablet toward Cross. Cross looked at it. Whatever he saw there. Made his jaw tighten. Those credentials, Mara said. Reference. Whose are they? Phillips looked at her with the expression of a man delivering bad news. He didn't entirely understand yet. They belong to a contractor account, third-party security firm. Caro Security Services. The name landed in the room and rearranged everything. Ada knew that name. Not from her 7 years at Redwood Mercy. Before. From the sealed file and the classified operation, and the career that had ended badly in the way she didn't talk about. Whitcaro had been on the periphery of that, not central, but adjacent. The kind of company that appears in the background of operations that are supposed to have no background. She kept her face entirely still. Cross was looking at her. She knew from the angle of his attention that he had registered her reaction, even though she'd given him almost nothing to register. He was that kind of observer. Caro, he said slowly. Athens still watching her. A security contractor with hospital records access, Mara said. That's an unusual service arrangement for a medical facility. Mr. Bexley. Cross said, turning. How long has Caro Security Services had active credentials in this facility's record system? Bexley's lawyer said. My client will not be answering any further questions tonight. Bexley wasn't listening to his lawyer. He was looking at Mara with the focused attention of a man who had just understood something that changed his position. And it was not the kind of understanding that brought relief. You were supposed to be gone, he said. The room went very quiet. Excuse me, Cross said, but Bexley wasn't talking to Cross. He was talking to Mara with the specificity of someone delivering a message they'd been carrying without knowing it. You were supposed to have transferred. The request went in 4 months ago. Internal restructuring, shift reallocation. It should have moved you to the Millbrook satellite facility. His voice was flat, almost matter-of-fact. You should have been gone. Mara understood several things simultaneously. The transfer request she'd received 4 months ago, internal routine seeming reassignment to Millbrook, 30 miles away. She'd pushed back on it quietly, citing continuity of care for long-term patients, and it had been withdrawn without explanation. She'd thought nothing of it. Administrative shuffles happened. She thought something of it now. You moved me because I'd recognize what you were doing, she said. The words came out even, but her mind was running ahead of them, assembling the architecture of something much larger than one dead soldier and one pre-signed form. If you knew Voss's transfer was coming, if you had a source in the operation, she paused. You knew what Caro was doing. You were part of it. Client. The lawyer started. My client, Bexley said, and stopped. Back down. Not the way he'd sat before, with the desk as a shield. He sat back the way people sit when the decision's been made and they're just waiting for the next part to start. You should have transferred, he said again, quieter this time. To Mara, specifically. To the room, to whoever was listening. That was the mistake. Cross looked at Mara. She looked back at him. She could see him adding up what he'd just heard, not just the admission embedded in it, but the implication. Bexley had known about her. That someone had told him she was in this building and represented a risk specific enough to require relocation. The attempt to move her out of the facility 4 months ago, and the pre-signed transfer form for Aldrichfus and the Caro credentials in the hospital record system were not separate events. They were the same event. They had always been the same event. Becker made a sound again, the small, quiet vocalization like punctuation. Then he lay down on the floor of Rowan Bexley's office and put his head on his paws and watched the door. He was waiting the whole time, in the way that trained dogs wait, not passively, but with the absolute conviction that what needed to happen was going to happen, and his job was to be present for it. Boss's radio. Crackled a voice said something she couldn't fully parse. Boss pressed the channel and said, "Copy that, bring them through." He looked at Mara review teams here early. He paused. They were closer than we expected. Apparently, they were already in the city. Maya looked at him. Already in the city since this morning, Cross said it carefully. Before the transport arrived here, which meant someone had known Redwood Mercy was relevant before Voss's body had ever come through its doors. The review team had been pre-positioned, the same way the transfer form had been pre-signed. The difference was which side had done the positioning. Downstairs, in the lobby of a hospital that had just had its record system frozen and its administrator cornered and its night security contractor placed under a credential hold, a federal review team was coming through the door, and they had not been sent by Bexley. Looked at the door, looked at Decker, looked at the small, careful way his ears were tracking the sounds from the building's lower floors. The way they'd tracked sounds in the supply room before the man with the syringe had arrived. "What is it?" Cross asked, watching her. "He hears something," she said. "The review team, maybe." She didn't move. Decker's ears were doing the specific adjustment that meant he was sorting sounds, and his body had the forward angle of alert, rather than the settled position of someone who'd just identified friends, or something ahead of them. Cross reached for his radio. It's in Bexley's office went out. In Bexley's office went out, and for 3 seconds the room operated entirely on the orange-gray light bleeding through the corner windows from the parking structure outside, which was enough to see by and not enough to be comfortable. Voss had his radio to his mouth before the 3rd second was done. Husky report static. Sir. We've got a power interruption. Floors 2 through 4. East wing. Backup generators should. A pause, sir. The generators aren't cycling. Not unknown. Maintenance is more static. Yes, sir. We have personnel movement in the stairwell. Multiple individuals. Civilian clothes coming up from the ground floor. Or was already moving. Not toward the door, toward Bexley's desk, because the desk was heavy and real, and in the right position relative to the door, and because she'd spent enough time in enough rooms to know that the first thing you do when the lights go out and unknown personnel start moving is put something solid between yourself and the entry point. Get away from the window, she said to no one and everyone. Voss was already away from it. His 2 soldiers had shifted to flank positions on either side of the door with a practiced efficiency of people who did not need light to know where they were supposed to be. Bexley's lawyer had moved to the corner. Bexley himself had not moved at all, which told Mara something she was still processing. Decker was on his feet. His body was oriented toward the door. His ears were flat, not the alert configuration, the other one. The generator override, Mara said, her voice low and directed at Bexley. Exit. Bexley said nothing. Bexley. She put enough into the word that it crossed the dark room and landed. That's the manual override for the backup power where. Basement mechanical room, he said, be level, but it requires a key card. Key card, a pause, facilities management. Hi. He stopped her. Yours, she said. He didn't answer. Which was the answer. Boss said. Husky, get someone to B level. Mechanical room. Boss manual generator override. Ow. Copy, sir. Moving. The sounds from the stairwell were closer. Loud. Careful, the kind of careful that is louder than noise to people who know what to listen for. Muffins. How many? Cross asked her because he'd noticed she was listening the same way he was. Maybe 4, she said, moving in pairs. One set has a different gait. Someone's carrying something. She paused. Weapons. 2 even equipment of some kind. Cross looked at her in the dark. Eyes. She could feel him deciding whether to ask and deciding not to. Lights. Where is Priel? Your team had him detained. Boss. Hit the radio again. Where is Priel? The answer came back ragged through the static. Sir, Priel is standby, and then a different voice, tighter. Colonel Priel is gone. Security, hand into what they thought was your detail. Wasn't your detail. The room absorbed that Velt Caro had people inside the building, not just credentials in the record system, physical personnel, present, coordinated, moving on a timeline that the power interruption had just clarified. It's going out wasn't a malfunction. It was a signal. As a cover. Probably both Mara thought about what Kowalski had said. The Federal Review team was already in the building. Coming up through the lobby, which meant Velt Caro's people in the stairwell, were either trying to reach Bexley's office before the review team did, or they were trying to reach something else on this floor before anyone could secure it. What's on this floor? She asked. Besides your office. Bexley said nothing. His lawyer said, I don't think this is records an X. Phillips said from behind her. She'd almost forgotten Phillips was still in the room. East end of the floor. That's where the digital server rack for the record system is physically housed. Off-site backup runs from there. The backup partition, IT said, hadn't been fully scrubbed. The one with the metadata that still showed Velt Caro's credentials tied to the deletions. They're not coming for Bexley, Mara said. They're coming for the server. This was already on the radio. I need 2 personnel at the medical records, Annex 3rd floor east immediately. Priority containment. He listened to whatever came back, and his expression told her it wasn't the answer he wanted. They're pinned at the lobby elevator, he said to her. 1. Pulled the elevator mechanical stop stairwells. 5. Both stairwells are showing movement. They've got the floor effectively isolated. 5. The footsteps in the near stairwell had stopped, which was sometimes better than footsteps and sometimes significantly worse. Ada looked at Decker. He was looking at the door. His body had the hair-trigger readiness of something that had done this before in a different context, and remembered it correctly. Onyx, she said. How far into the hall? Phillips said. 8 feet. Is there a second access point? Eva's corridor. You'd have to go through the supply junction. Ross looked at her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking the people in that stairwell came up this way, because the front stairwell is occupied by whoever's pinning your team downstairs, which means they've split their resources, which means the Annex team is probably 2 people, and they're working against the clock. She said it quickly, assembling it out loud because it was faster than thinking it through in silence. If they pull the server rack or destroy the backup partition before your review team gets there, the only physical evidence of the Velt Caro deletions is gone. You're not going to the Annex. Cross said, I'm not suggesting I go alone. She looked at him steadily. But someone needs to go now, and your soldiers need to be on that door. Ross made the specific sound of a man choosing between 2 bad options. Kowalski, he said into the radio. I need you in the 3rd floor supply junction in 90 seconds. Life. You're meeting someone there. Mara was already at the door. Bennett. Cross's voice stopped her at the frame. Eyes. She turned. He was a shape in the dark, and she couldn't see his expression, but his voice had something in it. She hadn't heard from him before. Not an order. Not even a request. Be careful, I'm always careful, she said, which was not entirely true, but was what the moment needed. She went into the hall, the 3rd floor at night, with the east wing power out, had the specific quality of a building that had become a different building. Emergency. Lighting at the floor level threw everything into low red contrast, enough to navigate wrong for detail. Corridor. Branched left 40 feet ahead. Lines. She moved along the right wall, which put the service junction between her and the stairwell door, and she listened as she moved. Becker was with her. She hadn't told him to come, he'd come, the way he'd been doing everything through assessment and decision, not command. He was slightly behind her left shoulder, the handler's position matching her pace exactly. His wrapped paw made a faint, uneven rhythm against the floor that she tracked without looking down. She did not have a weapon. This was the part of the situation that she was managing by not thinking about directly, because thinking about it would reroute cognitive resources she needed for other things. She had a hospital badge, a phone with 40% battery, 7 years of institutional knowledge about this building's layout, and a dog who had spent 3 years doing in active context what she was currently doing in a hospital corridor. The junction was 10 feet ahead. The stairwell door was further. She could see the emergency exit bar, glowing faintly red in the ambient light. Nobody had come through it yet. She turned into the supply junction. Kowalski was already there, which told her he'd moved fast and hadn't used the stairwell, which meant he knew a route she didn't. He had a flashlight and something that was not a flashlight in his other hand that she decided not to examine closely. In the Annex, he said, his voice barely above nothing. I passed the side window. They're at the server rack. One's got a drive. The other's running physical cable disconnects. Can your people get to the floor? 2 minutes. The situation is complicated. Complicated. Nice word. For whatever Velt Caro had done to the ground floor to buy time. Aya looked at the supply junction wall. There was a circuit panel. There she'd noticed it during a maintenance walkthrough 18 months ago, because the facilities manager had made a point of explaining which circuits ran which zones, and she'd listened the way she listened to everything, without apparent interest and with total retention. She went to it, opened the cover. What are you doing? Kowalski said. Onyx. And this junction are on the same emergency circuit segment. Isolate the segment. She was reading the labels, which were handwritten in the cramped notation of someone who'd labeled them years ago and had terrible handwriting. Lights in the annex go out too. They're working in the dark anyway, but they're using their own light source. They cut the whole segment. The panel display on the server rack goes dark. They lose their visual reference for what they've disconnected. Kowalski was quiet for a beat. That buys us what? 3 seconds? Enough for you to go through the annex door while they're disoriented. She found the right breaker. And enough for me to go through the service corridor entrance behind the rack. They're not going to expect anyone from the service corridor. She looked at him. I'm not engaging them. I'm going to the rack. If the drive is out, I can't put it back, but if it's still in, I can make it harder to remove than they're expecting. Kowalski stared at her for a second. Longer than was comfortable, then said 30 seconds. Go through the main door, you go through service. On 3. She counted, she pulled the breaker. The junction went dark somewhere. Down the annex corridor, a voice said something sharp and surprised. She moved the service corridor was a maintenance access lane that smelled of old cable insulation and filtered air, and she went through it faster than was wise with zero light, using the wall with her right hand as a guide, and trusting that she'd measured the distance correctly when she'd looked at the floor plan 18 months ago in a context where she'd had no idea it would ever matter. Decker was still with her. She could feel him alongside her left leg, which was how she knew she was tracking straight. The service door to the annex was a push panel, no lock from this side. She went through it low and fast and came up inside the annex with the specific kind of adrenaline that doesn't feel like adrenaline until afterward when your hands start to shake. 2 men, both with headlamps, one at the server rack with a drive partially extracted, other at the cable array caught mid-motion with a disconnect tool, both of them turning toward the main door where they expected the disturbance and not toward the service corridor where she'd come from. She had 2 seconds of misdirection. She used them to close the distance to the server rack and get her hands on the drive. The man at the rack turned as her fingers hit the drive housing, and for a fractional second they were both pulling in opposite directions, and she understood with the precise clarity of a bad situation revealing itself completely that she was not going to win a pulling contest with someone who outweighed her by 60 pounds. So she didn't pull. She pushed not on the drive, but on the rack itself, a sharp two-handed shove against the housing that shifted the whole unit 4 inches to the right, which was enough to bind the drive in its partially extracted position, jammed at an angle that made removal suddenly require realignment rather than simple force. The man swore Kowalski came through the main door. Followed was 20 seconds of the kind of closest quarters chaos that looks from the outside like confusion and feels from the inside like a very fast sequence of specific decisions. Kowalski had the second man, the cable technician, against the far wall before he'd completed his turn. The rack man released the drive to deal with what was coming through the service door, which was his tactical read of the situation. And it was wrong, because what came through the service door was Decker, not attacking. Decker had not been commanded to attack, and he was not a dog who went to violence without direction. But he came through that door with 90 pounds of Belgian Malinois in tension at full extension. And the rackman took one look at the clouded eye and the scarred face and the absolute absence of hesitation and made the very reasonable decision to stop moving. Baker stood between the man and the door. The man stood completely still. Kowalski secured the second individual with a zip restraint that materialized from somewhere on his person. He looked at Decker, he looked at Mara, he looked at the room in general. 30 seconds, he said, with the flat appreciation of someone who'd just recalibrated a data point. 5, Mara said. She went back to the rack. The drive was jammed at the binding angle she'd created. She had to straighten it carefully to extract it without damaging the housing further, and her hands were doing the thing she'd predicted they'd do, now that the adrenaline had somewhere to go. She ignored her hands and focused on the drive. It came free on the second adjustment. She held it under Kowalski's flashlight. It was a standard military-grade portable drive. No labels. The extraction slot on the rack showed it had been about 60% ejected, meaning whatever had been transferred to it was partial, and the backup partition data on the rack itself was still intact. We need your review team up here, she said right now. Can't be left unattended. Kowalski was already on his radio. She could hear from somewhere below them the sound of the building's activity changing. Register more voices, different movement patterns, the specific shift of a situation that is tipped from contested to controlled. Hobby apparently had resolved. She set the drive on top of the rack where the review team would find it, and leaned against the wall and took 4 breaths in a row, which was the amount of breathing she'd been neglecting for the last 6 minutes. Baker came and stood next to her. not leaning on her just alongside the way he'd been all night. Wasn't. She put her hand on his back without thinking about it, just her palm flat between his shoulder blades, and he didn't shift away. She could feel through her hand how tense he still was. How much effort the holding it together cost him, she understood that too, more than she could have explained to anyone in this building except possibly Cross. At the time, the Federal Review team reached the third floor. The annex was secured, and the two Velt Caro personnel were restrained, and the server rack was being documented with the kind of methodical attention that federal investigators brought to things they intended to use in court. The team lead was a woman named Sayer. She didn't offer a first name, just Sayer, with the authority of someone who'd decided titles were less efficient than surnames, who looked at the situation in the annex and then looked at Mara and then looked at Decker and said, "Walk me through it." Walked her through it. The whole thing from the trauma bay to the supply room to the office to the service corridor. She left nothing out and added nothing, just the facts in sequence. And Sayer listened without interrupting, which was the kind of listening that meant she was doing something with what she heard. Sayer said when she'd finished partial extraction. Maybe 30 to 40% of the backup partition data, if they were doing a straight sequential pull. The partition itself is intact. You handled the drive. I had to bind it in the slot and then extract it to preserve it. Prints are on the housing. She said it without apology. The alternative was letting them walk out with it. I looked at the drive on top of the rack. The alternative was letting my team handle it. Your team was 2 minutes out. Sayer said nothing for a moment. Then you have a medical background and you know the facility layout. You knew the breaker configuration for this segment. She paused. What else do you know? Mara considered. I know that Rowan Bexley attempted to transfer me to the satellite facility 4 months ago, and that the timing of that transfer request aligns with whatever Velt Caro's involvement in this facility began. I know that the transfer documentation for Sergeant Voss was pre-signed 3 hours before the transport arrived. I know that Velt Caro had active credentials in this hospital's record system, and that those credentials were used to delete intake documentation this afternoon improperly because the metadata survived. She paused again. And I know that Voss was 31 years old with no documented cardiac history. Doctor, how do you know that? His blood type was on his handler tag. No negative. His age was on the transfer form. His death classified as cardiac event. Those 3 things together don't produce the kind of body that came off that transport. She kept her voice even. I'm a trauma nurse. I see bodies. The presentation of a cardiac event in a healthy 31-year-old has a specific look. Wasn't that? Sarah was quiet for a long moment on them. Her team moved with careful efficiency, photographing and bagging and noting. The 2 Velt Caro men were being processed in the corner, with the particular silence of people who'd decided lawyering up was their best available option. You're going to need to give a full statement, Sayers said. This doesn't wait, I know. And I'm going to need your complete background, not the personnel file. Redwood Mercy has the complete background. Laura had known. This was coming since Bexley had said you were supposed to be gone. The seal on her record hadn't broken. Cross had said the number he'd called had protected it, but a federal review of a conspiracy that apparently touched her facility and her attempted reassignment was going. And on her history, whether the seal held or not. I'll need Cross present, she said. Sayer raised an eyebrow. Because he called the number, and whoever's on the other end of that number is going to want to know how this goes. Sayer's gaze. And because he's the one who decided to trust me without knowing why he should, and I think he's earned the courtesy of being in the room. Studied her for a beat that went a few seconds longer than comfortable. All right, she said. Get the colonel. Cross came into the annex and looked at the secured personnel and the server rack and the drive sitting on top of it, and then looked at Mara with the expression of a man who had updated his operating picture several times in the last hour and was no longer surprised by what he found when he turned corners. Office, she asked. Secured. Bexley's been formally detained. Federal Civil Authority. Sayer is making noise. But Sayer's team has the pre-signed form and the credential logs. He paused. Exactly. Said something just before they took him. He asked if you'd been briefed on what Voss found. I went. Still Voss found something, Cross said. It wasn't a question. Whatever he found is why someone wanted him dead. What did he say exactly? He said. And I'm quoting. If she already knows what Voss knew, then it doesn't matter what we do with the records. Cross watched her. Do you know what Voss knew? No, she said. But I know what Operation Vero was adjacent to 6 years ago. And if Voss stumbled onto the same thread, she stopped. I need to see Voss's field jacket, his service record, whatever, was supposed to accompany his body through the transfer. Heck, the field jacket was in the transfer bag. Kowalski secured it when they came in. Has anyone opened it? Not. Cross looked at her. Heck, it should go to Sayri's team. It should, she agreed. But I need to see it first. 2 minutes. Krotz studied her for exactly as long as it took him to make the decision. Then he said, 2 minutes. The field jacket was a military transport envelope, olive drab, sealed with a classification strip that had already been broken, which meant someone had opened it before the transport arrived. Kowalski brought it to the annex and set it on the equipment table and stepped back, and Mara opened it. The contents were what they should have been: service record, medical history, incident reports, casualty documentation, and she went through them in the systematic way she'd been trained to go through documents, one page, next page. Reading for the specific, rather than the general. She found it on page 9. It was an incident report filed by Voss dated 11 weeks ago. Operational context redacted. But the body of the report described an inventory discrepancy at a forward supply depot medical equipment, specifically surgical and pharmaceutical supplies, quantities inconsistent with requisition records. Voss had flagged it through his chain of command. The response in the record was a single notation, referred to contractor oversight VCS. CS Veltcaro Security Services. They had been referred to the contractor they were reporting on. He reported the discrepancy, Mara said. They referred the report to Veltcaro. Caro was the contractor running the supply operation. She looked at Cross. Cross filed a complaint about their supply depot, and it landed directly in their hands. 7 weeks later, he's dead of a cardiac event at 31. Cross's face had gone to the still-controlled expression. She associated with him doing something very difficult internally without letting it show. Supply operation, he said. Pharmaceutical supplies. Medical equipment. He was working towards something. Let him get there. Veltcaro had contracts for medical logistics at 3 forward operating facilities in the last 18 months. I know this, because Jag flagged an unrelated billing discrepancy last quarter, and I was on the review board. He paused. The billing discrepancy was closed as administrative error. He said a name. She didn't recognize it. From the way he said it, with the specific flatness of a person who has just understood that someone they worked alongside was not what they appeared to be. She understood that he did. How high does this go? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. Athens. He was looking at page 9 of Voss's field jacket and the VCS notation and doing the arithmetic of it. Enough, he said. That the review team being prepositioned in the city before we got here makes more sense now. Lines. Someone knew this was going to surface. Someone wanted to be ready. He looked at her. The question is whether they were positioned to contain it or to blow it open. Sire's team, Mara said. I don't know, Sire. I don't know who sent her. The room, which had felt like it was moving toward resolution, shifted under that. Dramatically. Nothing in the building changed. The investigators kept moving. The equipment kept being documented. But the architecture of the situation rearranged itself into something more complicated than a hospital administrator and a security contractor covering up a soldier's death. Looked at the field jacket, looked at the VCS notation, at the 11-week gap between Voss's report and Voss's body. Pharmaceutical supplies, she said. What kind of quantities are we talking about in the billing discrepancy? Voss told her. She did a rapid, ugly calculation. The numbers weren't the kind of numbers you got from skimming supply lines for personal profit. They were operational scale numbers. The kind of quantities that suggested not theft, but systematic diversion supplies, going somewhere specific in volume on a schedule. This is embezzlement, she said. This is a supply operation running parallel to the official one. Someone is moving medical supplies at scale through the military logistics chain using contractor oversight as cover. And this hospital she stopped, this hospital is in the domestic end of it. Wood Mercy is a receiving point or a documentation point. Both. Cross looked around the annex at the server rack, the drive, sitting on top of it. Everything that came through this facility's record system, everything Bexley approved, documentation for transactions that don't officially exist, she said. Yes. And Voss found the supply side and I'm the domestic end. She said it quietly. Understanding arriving with the specific unpleasantness of things that should have been obvious sooner. They tried to move me out of this facility because I'm the person who would recognize what Bexley was signing. Firms, the expedited transfers, the contractor credential access. I would eventually see enough of it to understand what it added up to. That's what Bexley meant. That's why they wanted me at Millbrook. You've seen forms like that before, Cross said. It wasn't quite a question. Lines. In a context I'm not going to specify in this room right now, she said. But yes, he was looking at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as him integrating information that changed the shape of something he'd already mapped. Not alarmed. Just reconfiguring the sealed record, he said. Operation I was involved with 6 years ago touched a supply irregularity in a different theater, she said. It was classified, and the case was closed, and I was removed from the situation because it became complicated. I didn't know at the time what I was looking at. I know now that what I was looking at was probably a different iteration of the same thing. She paused. And someone at Veltcaro apparently knew I'd been in that situation, which is why when they set up their domestic documentation operation at a hospital in Boise, they flagged a nurse on staff who had the background to recognize it. It was very quiet. They were right to flag me, she said. They were wrong about being able to move me. From across the annex, Sarah called her name. Sarah was standing at the evidence table with one of her team members and a tablet, and the expression of someone who has just found a thread she was not expecting and is not sure yet what it connects to. Bennett. I need you to look at something. Mara crossed the room. Turned the tablet toward her. On the screen was a personnel authorization log, hospital records, access credentials, and timestamps, and at the bottom of a list of Veltcaro access entries, there was a name, not a Veltcaro name, a military name, a rank, and access timestamp from 3 weeks ago. She looked at it for a long time, then she looked at Cross. He was across the room, not close enough to see the screen. He was watching her face, and from the way his expression shifted when he saw hers, he understood that whatever was on that tablet had just changed the shape of the thing again. That name, Mara said to Sarah, keeping her voice steady. That rank and that access timestamp. She set the tablet down. Is that person currently assigned to the review team? For one careful second then, no. They. Currently in the building, another pause. Shudder. We don't know. Mara looked at Cross. Cross pulled his radio. And from somewhere in the building below them, not the lobby, not the stairwell, from somewhere specific and interior and close came the sound of a single door slamming. The sound came from the second floor, not the stairwell interior. Somewhere in the East Wing's middle section, which put it near the Trauma Bay documentation office or the staff consultation rooms, both of which should have been empty at this hour, and neither of which had been on anyone's containment checklist because nobody had thought they needed to be. Boss had his radio up before the echo of the slam finished. All units. Interior sound. Second floor east. That's midsection. I need eyes. The responses came back in pieces. Kowalski was on 3. Lobby team was still processing the ground floor. 5. The 2 soldiers who'd been with Bexley's office were now outside it, guarding a man who'd been formally detained and was therefore not the problem or not the immediate one. And the name on that log's in the annex in 4 strides. Give me the full credential entry. Sarah pulled it up. Boss looked at it. Something in his face did the thing Mara had seen it do twice before, the small controlled shift that meant he'd received information that required him to reclassify something he'd already decided about. Dr. Drentalis, he said, not a question, confirming. Him. Mara said he was on the JG review board. 5. The billing discrepancy review I mentioned. Cross set the tablet down carefully the way you set down something you want to throw. He was the one who closed it as administrative error. The room understood what that meant without anyone having to say it. Wallace hadn't been an unwitting participant in a flawed review. He'd been the mechanism by which a genuine discrepancy had been reclassified as nothing. And 3 weeks ago his credentials had this hospital's record system, a civilian medical facility. He had no operational reason to touch. He knew the review team was coming, Sari said. He would have been in the communication chain. He knew we were here before we arrived, Cross said. Which means he knew what we were coming for, and he's in the building, Mara said. Nobody disputed that the slam had come from somewhere, and the building's exits had been covered since Sarah's team arrived, which meant whoever had made that sound was not coming in. They were already inside, had been inside, and had just done something that made enough noise to register 3 floors up, said. Kowalski, I need you on 2. Take east midsection now. You're looking for Major Drentalis. Do not approach without backup. Copy. Sir, moving. Mara was already thinking about the 2nd floor east midsection. Left. Consultation rooms, documentation office, and the auxiliary evidence staging area that Sayer's teams had set up 2 hours ago as a preliminary holding point for physical documents before transporting them to the main federal evidence facility. She'd seen it established when Sayer's people had moved through. Standard procedure. Temporary, just a locked room with a posted guard. Staging area, she said to Sarah, second floor east. Yes, that's where your preliminary physical evidence is. I was already moving. Posted guard should arrive. The guard reported in 20 minutes ago. One of Sayre's team members said, checking a log. Not since. They moved. The staging area was a consultation room that Mara had sat in twice for personnel reviews and once for a patient family meeting that had gone badly. A window, a table, 4 chairs, and a lock that Sayre's team had upgraded with a portable security bar when they'd set it up. The security bar was on the floor in the hallway, which was not where it was supposed to be. The posted guard, a young federal agent named Rice, whom Mara had seen briefly during Sayre's team setup, was in the hallway. Seated against the wall, with his hands zip-tied in front of him and a cut on his temple that had bled enough to be alarming, but was already clotting. He was conscious, which was the first good thing. He came from the ceiling panel. Reese said, his voice thick but tracking. I didn't. There's an HVAC access above the consultation room. I didn't know long ago, Sayre said. Maybe 12. I pushed the consultation room door open. The room was partially disrupted. One of the boxes opened, content spread on the table. Another box missing entirely. The portable hard drive case that had contained preliminary digital copies of the credential logs was still on the table, but open and empty. Cross stood in the doorway and looked at it. He didn't have time to take everything, Mara said. Box 1 drive. He was working fast, and he left when Reese started making noise. She looked at the spread documents on the table. That's gone. Sayre's team member went through it with the systematic speed of someone trained for this. The original Velt-Caro credential authorization chain, the physical document establishing their access to the hospital system, and the preliminary copy of the VOS intake deletion log. Not the partition itself, Mara said. That's still in the annex. The partition is still there, Sayre confirmed. But the authorization chain was a physical document, original signatures, original dates. The partition shows what was deleted and when and by which credentials. Authorization chain shows who established those credentials and signed off on Velt-Caro's access to begin with. She paused. Without it, we can show what the credentials did. As cleanly show who authorized them to exist. Tallis authorized them, Cross said. Tallis's name is in the access log on the partition. That's digital. His lawyers will argue it's insufficient without the physical authorization document. Sayre was doing the legal architecture of it in real time, her voice controlled but tight, not insurmountable. But it makes the chain of custody messier, and it gives them a window. Hackett's Cross looked at Rice. Which direction did he go? Rice toward the stairwell north end. Stairwell led to the roof access or to the ground floor via the back of the building, which was the loading dock's side, the one area that had been covered less heavily because the dock entrance required a key card. Key card that a major with active credentials in this facility's system could have provisioned himself through the same access point he'd used to enter the record system 3 weeks ago. He's going for the loading dock, Cross said. Mara was already calculating. The north stairwell to the loading dock was 4 floors down and a building length away. Ice had a 12-minute head start and knew the facility's credential system. Dock's external gate logged key card entries. If he'd pre-provisioned access, the log would show it, but that was only useful after he was already gone. There's a secondary gate, she said, the pharmaceutical receiving dock. From the main loading dock around the south corner of the building's ground level. It's on a different card system. Older, doesn't integrate with the main network. Credentials wouldn't work on it. Cross looked at her. Fine. And the key for the manual override is in the facilities management office on the ground floor. It's the same key that opens the generator override panel. She paused. If he doesn't know about the secondary gate, he's going to have to come out through the main dock, which your people have covered. If he does know about it and tries the manual override, he needs the facilities key, which is in a room your people have not specifically secured because nobody thought about the pharmaceutical dock. Cross was on the radio before she finished the sentence, routing 2 people to the facilities management office with the specific instruction to secure the manual override key and the room it was in. Mara heard the acknowledgement come back and felt something she recognized as provisional, not relief, just the slight easing of one pressure point while the others held. Becker had been in the hallway throughout this, positioned outside the consultation room door with the specific orientation of a dog who has tracked a scent and is waiting to be told what to do about it. Mara had learned to read him quickly, the way you learn to read instruments when you need them. He was pointing south, not north-south. He didn't go to the stairwell, she said. Stopped mid-transmission. What? Decker is pointing south, not south. She watched the dog. Decker's nose was down, his body angled toward the south end of the corridor with the absolute conviction of something that did not make navigational errors. Rice, said North Stairwell, but Rice had a head injury, and it was dark, and he was disoriented. Rice may have wanted him to say North Stairwell. Beatcross made the decision, the way he made all of them quickly, and without apparent anguish. Which she'd come to understand was not the absence of doubt, but the discipline not to perform it. Mara looked at Decker. Shush, she said quietly. What followed was something she hadn't done in 6 years, which was follow a working dog through a building on a track, and it came back with the disorienting familiarity of muscle memory, not comfortable exactly, but operational. She stayed 2 paces behind his left shoulder, crossed 2 paces behind hers, and they moved through the south corridor of the second floor at the pace Decker set, which was faster than she'd expected given his paw. He was ignoring the paw entirely now. She registered this and set it aside. The south corridor terminated at the hospital chapel anteroom, a small secular reflection space that nobody much used and that connected lives through a side passage she'd known about because she'd once helped an elderly patient navigate to the south elevator lobby. The south elevator lobby was not on anyone's direct coverage route because the south elevators had been out of service for 3 weeks, pending a maintenance contract. Out of service, elevators still had functional shafts. Decker stopped at the anteroom door. He was at full alert, ears forward, weight distributed in the configuration she'd stopped needing to analyze consciously. Someone was on the other side of that door. Cross put his hand on her shoulder, pulling her back. She went. This was his domain, not hers, and she knew the difference between the situations where she needed to be in front and the ones where she needed to step aside, and this was the second kind. He signaled. His 2 available soldiers, who had come up silently behind them in the last 60 seconds, moved into position on either side of the anteroom door. Put his hand on the handle, 3 fingers too. The door opened on a man crouched beside the south elevator panel with a box under one arm and a drive case in his other hand. Major Dren Tallis looked up from the elevator shaft access. He'd been working to open and saw 4 people and a dog in the doorway and made the calculation that took approximately 1 second and reached the same conclusion anyone would reach. He set the box down. He set the drive case down. He straightened up and put his hands where they needed to be and said, "I want an attorney." "You'll get," Cross said. The box was there. The drive case was there. Whatever Tallis had taken from the staging area was in this room because he'd been 1 layer of locked accesses away from the shaft ladder that was his exit route, and he hadn't made it through. Watched the soldiers move Tallis to the wall and begin the process of securing him, and she felt the specific, unremarkable sensation of a situation that has been running at crisis pitch for hours beginning to decompress. Not finished. Nowhere near finished. Because Tallis had a lawyer coming, and the legal architecture was going to take months, and the operation behind all of this was bigger than 1 JAG officer and 1 hospital administrator. But this particular room, this particular night, was moving from chaos to process. She understood process was manageable. Decker sat down next to her and looked at Tallis with the same direct attention he'd given Bexley in the administrator's office. Not aggressive, just present courting. "Good boy," she said very quietly. Look at her. He was still watching Tallis. But his tail moved once, twice, the smallest possible concession to the compliment. The next 4 hours were the administrative aftermath of a building that had been effectively a federal evidence site for an evening. Sayer's team processed the recovered materials from the anteroom with the careful documentation that would make them prosecutable. Was transferred to federal custody before midnight, which required paperwork that Cross and Sayre completed in Bexley's vacated office with the grim efficiency of people working through necessary unpleasantness. Bexley's lawyer attempted to negotiate terms in the hallway outside and was told with professional courtesy that negotiation was not currently on the schedule. Mara gave her formal statement in the second-floor break room to a federal recorder and one of Sayre's investigators, sitting at the same table where she'd eaten lunch for 7 years, and went through everything in the sequence it had happened. The investigator asked good questions. She answered them honestly, including about her background that she'd spent 6 years not discussing. Because the seal on that record had effectively been broken by the night's events regardless, and there was no longer a version of this story that didn't include her in it fully. She answered the questions about the previous operation, the one 6 years ago, the supply irregularity she'd flagged in a different theater, the classified closure that had removed her from the situation. She answered them without editorializing and without omission, and without performing the discomfort she felt about saying them out loud in a break room in a hospital she'd been hiding in, because the performance of discomfort was a luxury that the situation didn't have room for. The investigator thanked her when they were done. She went and got a cup of coffee from the machine that always dispensed it slightly too hot, and she stood at the window and watched the parking structure lights and let herself be tired for a few minutes before the next thing started. Ross found her there. He got his own coffee from the machine, looked at the cup, set it down. "This is talking," he said. She turned already. I advised him not to. He's doing it anyway. Apparently he's decided that being the most cooperative person in the room is his best position. Cross's voice was flat in the way that covered something more complicated. He gave us 4 names: 2 are Veltcaro executives. Are active military, both above my pay grade. That how far up, she said. Far enough. That Sarah got on the phone with someone above her when she got the names, and then that person got on the phone with someone above them, and the conversation has been going on for 40 minutes. He looked at his coffee. It's a procurement operation. Pharmaceutical and medical equipment supply, diverted systematically across multiple theaters over approximately 30 months, sold through a parallel distribution chain to buyers that Thales hasn't fully identified yet but is working on. The domestic documentation: this facility was one of 3 hospitals used to sanitize the paper trail for you. Side transactions. 30 months, she said. This started before Voss filed his report. About 2 years, Cross was quiet for a moment. Voss found a discrepancy and reported it, and it landed on Thales's desk. Referred it to Veltcaro. Veltcaro made a decision about Sergeant Voss. She held the coffee cup with both hands. The window showed her the parking structure and the orange lights and nothing else, which was fine. She didn't need to be looking at anything. He was 31, she said. Yes, he had the dog for 22 months. Yes, Cross said it simply without adding anything to it, which was the right thing. She stood there for a moment longer. Then she said the cause of death on the transfer form. Cardiac event. Do you know yet what actually happened? Ayer's team has requested an independent autopsy. Based on what Thales has said, and he's being vague about this specifically, possibly, because it's the thing that takes him from conspiracy to something much worse. There was a medication administration event during his evacuation transport, something that was logged as a standard treatment measure. He paused. The transport was managed by Veltcaro personnel. Set her coffee cup down. They medicated him during transport. That's the current red. She thought about the pharmaceutical supply operation. What you could do. If you had systematic access to military medical supplies and a logistics chain that nobody was fully auditing, when you needed to make a 31-year-old soldier's death look like a cardiac event during a standard medical evacuation. It was the most sickening thing she'd allowed herself to understand all night, and she'd been understanding a lot of sickening things. The independent autopsy, she said. Will it show it? Think so. They know what to look for now. He paused. Take time. But yes, she nodded, picked up the coffee again. It had cooled to a drinkable temperature while they'd been talking, which was the small logistical mercy of the hour. Background, she said the statement I gave. How much of that stays sealed? Said the operational details of the prior case stay classified. 5. Your involvement in this one is going to be documented in the federal case record, but what you were before Redwood Mercy isn't public record. He looked at her. The nurses' board is going to have questions. The hospital administration is in federal hands, which means Claudette Marsh is functionally running the facility until they appoint someone, and Claudette is going to have a lot of questions about tonight. Claudette always has a lot of questions, Mara said. Wrong too. No, she's not, Mara considered. I'll talk to her. She deserves a real conversation. Cross was quiet for a moment. Then, for what it's worth, the transfer request they put in 4 months ago, the one trying to move you to Millbrook. I pulled it while you were giving your statement. The internal request was authored Exley's administrative credentials, but the initiating communication, the directive that told him to move, you came from an email account that traces back to Veltcaro's regional operations. He paused. They identified you by your professional license renewal. Your name, nursing specialty, and employment location are in a public state database. Someone cross-referenced it against their internal risk list. Risk list, she said. People who had been in the proximity of their earlier operations and had the background to recognize the pattern if they saw it again. He paused. Athens. She sat. With that, the specific quality of having been identified as a risk by the people who were doing the thing she'd eventually recognize, and the particular irony that their attempt to manage that risk had been the thing that kept the situation in the building long enough for a dead soldier's dog to hold a trauma bay for 2 hours while the right questions started getting asked. "Baker," she said. "Where is he? Kowalski's with him. Corridor, first floor. There's a vet en route, sir." Arranged it. Cross's voice shifted slightly. The paw is going to need more than the field dressing you put on it. But she said the technique you used was, she said the infection would have been significantly worse without the intervention. Who said that? The vet. She looked at what you did and asked who'd wrapped it. Didn't say anything to that. The military's position on the dog, Cross said, is going to need to be decided. His official handler is deceased. The program would normally cycle him back for reassignment evaluation, but given his age and the injury to his eye, and he stopped. There are going to be decisions about his future that I don't control. She understood what he wasn't saying. "I'm not making any decisions tonight," she said. "I'm just the nurse who had a very long shift." "That's fair." She drank the last of her coffee, looked at the parking structure. What about the drive back to her apartment that she'd rented because it allowed dogs? But she'd never tested that provision because she'd never had one. The 2 military names. Tallis gave. She said, "Above your pay grade." "How does that get handled without disappearing?" "Sarah's been in contact with the Inspector General's office for the last hour," Cross said. "The case is being transferred out of JG entirely because of Tallis's involvement and the rank of the other names. It goes to a review body that nor the involved personnel can touch." He paused. "It's going to be a long process. These things always are. But it's going to happen. It's going to happen." He said it with the specific weight of a person who was not certain of many things, but was certain of this one. His report is in the record. His field jacket is in evidence. The partition data shows the credential access and the deletions and the timeline. His talking Bexley is detained. He looked at her. Operation ran for 30 months because nobody connected the domestic documentation to the supply side. You connected it in about 4 hours with a pre-signed transfer form and a dog that wouldn't move. She felt something shift in her chest that she wasn't going to name. "I had help," she said. "You had a colonel who almost had his sergeant restrain you in the trauma bay and is now very glad he didn't." He said it without quite smiling, but close. It was a near thing. 2 in the morning, Redwood Mercy was still technically an active federal evidence site, but the acute crisis had resolved into the slow machinery of documentation and transfer and interagency communication. The actual patients, the ones who'd been in the building through all of this and had been shielded from most of it by a nursing staff that had continued functioning throughout with the particular professionalism of people who know that the building's political problems are not the patient's problem, had been managed. The night staff had held things together. Mara had checked in on the construction worker's post-surgical consult and the 17-year-old's discharge and the chest pain patient who'd turned out to be anxiety after all, and all 3 had been handled correctly, and she felt a complicated mix of pride in her colleagues and guilt for having been elsewhere. She was sitting on the east corridor floor, her back against the wall outside the room where the vet was finishing with Decker when Sayri found her. Sayre sat down next to her, which was not what Mara had expected from a federal investigator in a charcoal suit who'd spent the last 6 hours running a multi-floor evidence operation. Sayre sat down against the wall, like a person who needed to be off her feet and didn't have the energy to pretend otherwise. "The case is moving," Sayre said. "You'll be contacted for additional testimony. Probably more than once. I know your background, the prior operation. It's going to come up in discovery eventually, regardless of what stays sealed. You should get representation, I know that too. Often. For a moment, you've been here 7 years. Yes. Before that, 2 years in wherever that was. Yes. And before that," Sayre paused the record that the number takes you to. Looked at the corridor wall. "Yes. Were you hiding?" Sayre asked it, the way she asked everything directly without softening it with anything. Mara thought about honestly. At first, later, she considered. Later. "I think I was just living. The two feel similar from the inside sometimes." Sayre nodded slow. "The hospital board is going to want to know what they had on staff." "I know. For what it's worth, the review team's position is that what you did tonight, the dog, the breaker, the annex, the track is materially the reason this case is intact rather than half destroyed." She said it without inflection as fact. That's going in the official record. Before Mara could answer, the door opened and the vet came out, a compact woman named Dr. Chakras, who had arrived at midnight with a field kit and the calm efficiency of someone used to treating animals in non-ideal conditions. "He's stable," Ferris said. "The paw needed debridement and a proper course of antibiotics, which he's started on. Is old damage chronic. But managed. He's not in pain right now. She paused. Like, he's been asking for you. Mara stood up. Dogs don't ask for people the way humans do, Ferris said, but they have ways of being clear about it. Like, he's been clear. She stepped aside. Mara went into the room. Decker was on a padded surface that Ferris had set up, not a proper veterinary table, but adequate, which described a lot of things about tonight. Paul was properly dressed now, the real work done, eyeing on his sons. And he looked for the first time since the trauma bay like something that had stopped running on the emergency reserves. It had been running on for days. He lifted his head when she came in. She sat on the floor next to the padded surface, same as she'd done in the supply room hours ago. Same level, no reaching. He put his head back down but oriented toward her. His good eye was half closed. She sat with him and listened to the building around them, and didn't try to make anything out of the moment except what it was, which was a dog who'd been carrying something enormous, finally being somewhere quiet, and a woman who'd been carrying something for 6 years, sitting next to him in the corridor of a hospital that had just become very publicly, not the place she'd been hiding in, but the place where she'd stopped hiding. She didn't know yet what came after that. She was going to have conversations that would be difficult and processes that would take longer than she wanted and decisions about her future that she couldn't make tonight. She knew all of that. She also knew that outside this room, Sarah was on the phone with the Inspector General's office, and Cross was finishing the documentation on Talas's transfer. Since somewhere in the building, the evidence that would take Bexley and Talas, and the names above them through a federal process, was being carefully handled by people who were good at their jobs. And she knew that in 3 hours at the edges of the night, Kalski was going to come and tell her something that she wasn't prepared for something. Sari had found in the final review of the partition data that none of them had looked for, because none of them had known to look for it. Something that changed not just the shape of the case, but the shape of everything that had happened before it. She didn't know that yet. She was just sitting with the dog. His breathing ebbed out, his eye closed fully. For a few minutes he slept. And in the pocket of his worn harness, pressed against the strap where someone had threaded them months ago, Aldrich Voss's dog tags caught the light and held it. Looked at them for a long time. Then Kowalski knocked on the door. Kowalski knocked on the door and then opened it without waiting, which told her before he said a word that whatever he was carrying wasn't the kind of thing that could wait for an invitation. He looked at Decker, first the habit of a soldier checking on an asset, and then looked at Mara on the floor and made no comment about finding a federal witness sitting against a wall in the dark next to a sleeping dog. He'd stopped being surprised by Mara's locations approximately 8 hours ago. "Her needs you," he said. Now she got up without asking why. She'd learned over the course of this night that when Kowalski said now, he meant it in the specific military sense of the word, which had no room in it for questions that could be answered by simply moving. Decker woke. When she stood, his head came up alert, and she put her hand on his back, once the flat palm pressure that she'd been using all night, the one he'd decided meant something, and said, "Stay with Dr. Phosphorus." He watched her go. He didn't follow, which was either a sign that he understood or a sign that his paw had finally registered its own condition, and his body had overruled him. Probably both. Sarah was in the documentation office at the end of the East Corridor, which had been converted over the last 2 hours into a working evidence processing station. She was standing at the table with 2 of her team members and a laptop, and she had the expression of someone who has found a thing they weren't looking for and is still working out what it means. "Partition backup," Sarah said when Mara came in. "We've been going through the full metadata log, not just the Veltcaro deletions, everything, like every access event in the system over the past 18 months. She turned the laptop. "This is what we found." Mara looked at the screen. It was a log of access events, time-stamped, credential tagged. She scanned down it the way she read anything, looking for the thing that didn't fit the pattern, the entry that broke the rhythm of the surrounding entries. She found it about a third of the way down, a records access event 14 weeks ago. A deletion. A creation, a new file created in the system under a set of credentials that had been deactivated 18 months prior. Credentials that belonged to a former Redwood Mercy employee who'd left the facility and whose access should have been terminated on departure. The file that had been created was a document, a single document, small in size, placed in a subdirectory of the records archive that was used for administrative correspondence and was therefore the least examined section of the system. The kind of place you put something if you wanted it to be findable by someone who knew where to look, and invisible to everyone who didn't. The document had 1 line of text. Mara read it, then she read it again. "Someone put this here 14 weeks ago," Sari said. using deactivated credentials, which means they had access to the old credential data. Either they were the original user or someone gave them the login information. 5. The file was never accessed after it was created. It was just sitting there, waiting, Mara said, for someone who would know what it meant. Sarah looked at her eyes. Do you know what it means? Mara looked at the single line of text on the screen. Eyes. It was a case reference number, a specific format used in military administrative proceedings, the kind of numbers assigned to a formal investigative file. She knew the format because she'd seen it in the operation 6 years ago. 5. She knew this specific number because she'd been given it at the time as the reference for the inquiry that had classified her out of her position and sealed her record. Her own case number. Placed in this hospital's record system 14 weeks ago by someone using deactivated credentials in a folder where it would only mean something to one person. I was here, she said. The room was quiet. He put it there, she said, working through it as she said it. He found the supply discrepancy. He filed his report, it went to Talus, and then he understood what that meant, that it wasn't going to be reviewed, it was going to be buried. And that he was probably in a worse position than he'd been before he filed it. She paused. So he went looking for other people who'd seen the same pattern. Aspire. Operation, my case was in the same classified family. He found the case number, he found the facility. He found a way to leave a marker in a system he knew would eventually be examined. He was telling you that he knew what you'd seen, Sarah said. He'd seen the same thing. He was telling me that when it came apart, if it came apart, there was a thread that connected his situation to the prior case. The thing wasn't isolated, she straightened up. He filed a report that he knew was going to be used against him. And before anything happened to him, he tried to make sure someone who could recognize the pattern would be able to find the connection. Let the silence sit for a moment. He used deactivated credentials. We don't know yet how he got them. Someone helped him, Mara said. Then someone inside this facility who trusted him enough to give him access, she thought. The former employee, whose credentials were these originally. Check the logger records administrator named Petra Vance. Terminated 14 months ago, we're locating her. Filed the name. If Vance helped him, she may have information about what Voss knew beyond what's in his field jacket. We're already on it. Sarah closed the laptop. But I wanted you to see the document first. Because the case reference number, your case is going to come up in the full federal investigation. The connection between the prior operation and this one is going to be part of the record. I know. And it means your involvement in tonight isn't incidental. It means Voss, whether he knew your name or just your case, specifically left a marker intended to activate someone with your background. She looked at Mara directly. You weren't a bystander who happened to be in the right place. He was counting on the possibility that you'd be in the right place. Thought about the trauma bay, the pre-signed form. The way she'd read the gurney tag in 3 seconds, because some things you can't train yourself not to do. She thought about Decker, who'd been left at a civilian hospital with a dead handler, because someone had believed that the dog's behavior would create enough disruption to bring the right kind of attention, or because they hadn't been able to stop it. She thought about the 4 months ago, when Bexley had tried to move her to Millbrook, and the quiet instinct she'd had that the reassignment felt wrong, and the quiet way she'd declined it. She hadn't known why she'd declined it. She'd told herself it was about patient continuity. Maybe it was. Maybe it was something else. Maybe the line between instinct and knowledge is thinner than it looks from the outside. Voss did. She said took a specific kind of courage. To know something was going to happen and to use the time you had left to build something that might matter afterward. She paused. He deserved better than what they did to him. He's going to get it, Sari said. That's what I can tell you. It's going to take time. And it's going to go through processes that are slower and more frustrating than they should be. The record is intact. Talus is talking. Bexley is detained. And the IG's office is now running the military side. The people responsible for what happened to Sergeant Voss are not going to find a quiet exit from this. Mara looked at the closed laptop at the table, at the documentation-covered surface of a room she'd used for personnel reviews and difficult family conversations, and was now using for this. Okay, she said. It was not an eloquent response. It was the only one she had. The federal press release came out 11 days later. Aya read it on her phone at the kitchen table of her apartment at 6 in the morning. Coffee that was better than the hospital machine, and a dog sleeping on the rug near the window because he'd decided on the second night that the rug near the window was his. She hadn't made a formal decision about Decker, yet there were military processes governing the disposition of retired service animals, and those processes had their own timelines, and Dr. and Ferris had been very clear about proper procedure, but Decker had made a series of informal decisions that were collectively more binding than any official paperwork, and so here they were. The release was 3 paragraphs of official language that translated, stripped of its bureaucratic coding, to this: Rowan Bexley, former administrator of Redwood Mercy Medical Center, had been indicted on 7 federal counts, including obstruction of justice, conspiracy to conceal a wrongful death, and accessory to fraud in connection with a federal contracting operation. Marcus Priel faced 4 counts as a co-conspirator. Major Drentalis had been stripped of rank and charged with conduct unbecoming obstruction conspiracy. The first count in what the release described as an ongoing military justice proceeding that had so far implicated 3 additional individuals at the 06 level and above. 2 senior executives of Velt Caro Security Services had been arrested at their respective locations, their corporate accounts frozen pending a full financial audit that the release noted covered 30 months of procurement contracts across 4 operational theaters. The company name Velt Caro would not survive the audit. The release didn't say this, but Sayer had told her in the matter-of-fact tone she used for things she was certain of, that the company's entire federal contracting portfolio was being suspended pending review, which in the government contracting world was the equivalent of a death sentence delivered by paperwork. Paragraph 2 mentioned the role of federal investigators and military personnel in preserving the evidence and building the case. It mentioned Colonel Ethan Cross by name, which Mara thought he would probably find uncomfortable, and which he probably deserved anyway. It mentioned Sayer's team. It did not mention Mara Bennett, which was how she'd asked it to be, and Sayer had respected that without argument. Paragraph 3 was the one she read twice. It stated that the military had conducted an independent autopsy of Sergeant First Class Aldrich Voss, and that the cause of death had been determined to be acute respiratory suppression, resulting from the administration of a contraindicated pharmaceutical compound during transport, administered by a Velt Caro personnel member who had since been charged with murder in the first degree. The death had been reclassified accordingly. Sergeant Voss would receive full posthumous military honors, including the commendation he'd been denied, and a formal ceremony was being arranged at his home installation. Mara set down her phone. Outside the window, Boise was doing its morning thing light coming up over the western edge of the valley, the specific quality of early light in a city that hadn't quite woken up yet. She'd lived here for 7 years, and she still thought the mornings were something that had never changed regardless of what else was happening. Becker lifted his head from the rug. He looked at her for a moment, made the assessment he always was made fine or at least stable, and put his head back down. His paw was healing. Ferris had been out twice for follow-up, and the infection had cleared and the dressing was off now, and he walked on it without favoring it except when he forgot to, which was less often each day. It wasn't going to change, and he'd organized his world around it with the adaptability that she'd noticed in him from the trauma bay and continued to find remarkable. He navigated by the right side, compensated with his nose, and seemed to have concluded that reduced peripheral vision on the left was a logistical problem rather than a tragedy. She admired that about him. She was working on applying the same framework to several of her own situations. Claudette Marsh had the conversation. Mara had promised her 3 days after the night in question in the same break room where Mara had given her statement over coffee that neither of them drank very much of. Claudette had known going in more than Mara expected. The federal review process had required the hospital's administrative staff to be interviewed, and Claudette had been interviewed extensively, and she was not a woman who failed to draw conclusions from available information. I'm not angry, Claudette said, which was a very Claudette way of opening a conversation that was clearly going to contain some anger. Okay. Mara said, I want to be clear about what I'm not angry about. I'm not angry that you intervened with the dog or the colonel or any of it. I've had enough time to think about what that night would have looked like if you hadn't. And she stopped. I'm angry that you were here for 7 years and I didn't know who I had. Looked at her coffee. I wasn't hiding from you specifically. I know that. That doesn't make it less strange to realize that the person I've been trusting with level 2 trauma cases for 7 years has a background that is classified. She said the word with the specific distaste of someone who believes that most things should be explicable. I run a department, Mara. I make staffing decisions based on what I know about the people in it. Nice. You made correct staffing decisions, Mara said. My nursing record is real. Everything I told you about my qualifications was accurate. I know. Claudette paused. The federal investigators told me that your prior background was the reason you were able to handle the situation the way you did, and that without it, the evidence that broke the case open would have been destroyed before anyone could secure it. She said it evenly, presenting a fact she was still processing. So professionally, I understand that your being here, all of it, the parts I knew, and the parts I didn't, produced an outcome that I would not want to reverse. Mara said, but I would like going forward to know who I'm working with. Considered this, it was a reasonable thing to want. It was also a complicated thing to give, because some of what she was had no language outside its original context, and some of it she was still deciding how to carry. But Claudette wasn't asking for classified details. She was asking to be treated like someone whose trust had been earned and who deserved honesty in return. I'll tell you what I can, Mara said in stages. I can. Claudette was quiet for a moment then. That's more than you've given me in 7 years. Fine. No, fine. Claudette picked up her coffee. That's where we'll start. The hospital board installed an interim administrator while the federal process worked through Bexley's institutional legacy, which was considerable and largely bad. The interim administrator was a woman named Rosalind Garrett, who had run 2 other hospital systems and who arrived with the energy of someone who had been given a mess and was professionally interested in messes. She met with Mara on her first week. I've read everything, Garrett said, which in context meant both the federal case summaries and the internal personnel file. I want you to know that the board's position is that you are an asset to this facility and that we intend to make sure that's reflected in your formal standing here. A formal standing is fine, Mara said. The transfer request that Bexley filed 4 months ago is being formally expunged from your record. Complaint notation, he added. When you intervened with the military transfer is being removed. I wasn't worried about the complaint notation. Garrett looked at her. Most people would be, I know what I did and why I did it. Someone else's paperwork doesn't change that. Garrett studied her for a moment with the expression of a person recalibrating. The nursing board reviewed the situation as well. Position is that your actions and spelled expand scope of care during an emergency scenario, and that no disciplinary review is warranted. She paused. There was some discussion about what exactly your scope of care is given your background, but the consensus was that it worked out in the building's favor, and they were going to leave it there. Mara almost smiled. The nursing board's pragmatism was one of the things she'd always respected about them. There's one other thing, Garrett said. The military has been in contact about the K-9 unit. She said the name carefully as though she was aware it had weight. They've submitted paperwork for his formal retirement from active service given his injuries and age. There's a process for civilian adoption of retired military working dogs. I know the process, Mara said. I imagine you do. Garrett slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. The colonel submitted a letter of support on your behalf. So did the federal review team lead. The military program coordinator told me, and I'm quoting, that she has never seen a letter of support submitted by 2 separate federal entities for a single adoption application. Mara looked at the paper. At the top, it had the military program's letterhead and a case number and her name. At the bottom, it had an approval notation. It's been processed, Garrett said. He's yours. Officially, Mara held the paper and did not say anything for a moment because the moment didn't need anything said in it. Thank you, she said finally. It came out quieter than she intended. Thank the colonel, Garrett said. He apparently made some calls. Boss came to the facility one more time, 6 weeks after the night in question, to close out some documentation sin with Sayre's team, and to, she suspected, check on things he didn't want to check on over the phone. He found her in the east corridor at the end of her shift, which was where he'd first found her standing with the dog in the supply room, and the geographic echo of it was not lost on either of them. Pled, he said. The 206s are contesting, which means it goes to a full proceeding, which means it's going to take a year and be unpleasant. He said it without particular surprise. But the evidence is solid. The IG's team has been through every Veltcaro contract in the relevant period. A supply diversion was larger than we estimated. It touched 6 facilities in 3 theaters. The domestic documentation side had 3 hospitals. We've identified the other 2 Bexley. He's going to trial. His legal team is operating under duress from the contractor relationship, which is a creative reading of the facts and probably won't work. Cross paused. The murder charge on the Veltcaro transport operative, the one who administered the compound to Voss, that's federal. She nodded. It was the right outcome, and it was also inadequate, and she had made her peace with the fact that those 2 things could both be true. Was not a system that returned what it took. It was a system that documented what had happened and assigned consequence, and sometimes consequence was as close to justice as anything got. A ceremony for Voss. She said 2 weeks from Saturday. His family has been notified. His mother Cross paused, and in the pause was the specific difficulty of a person who has had to deliver and receive a lot of hard information, and finds this particular kind hardest. Mother was told the real cause of death 6 weeks ago. Before the press release, the IG's office sent someone in person. He paused again. She asked about the dog. Mara looked at him. She asked if the dog was being cared for, Cross said. That was her question. Before any of the other questions. Before the ceremony, before the honors, before the legal process, she asked about the dog. Mara thought about a woman she'd never met, receiving the worst possible confirmation of the worst possible thing she'd feared, and asking first about the animal her son had spent 22 months working alongside. It said something about Voss, about what he'd been, what he'd talked about, how his mother had understood his life, that the question that mattered first was whether Decker was okay. He's okay, Mara said. He's better than okay, I told her. Cross looked at her steadily. To meet him when she's ready. Whenever she wants, Mara said. That's open. Cross nodded. They stood in the corridor for a moment, in the comfortable silence of people who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. Then he said, the military has been in contact about your record. Operational details stay sealed, but the classification on your service separation is being reviewed. The circumstances that led to it, he stopped. The prior operation connected to a supply irregularity. Now that we have the full architecture of the Veltcaro operation, it's clear that what you identified 6 years ago was an earlier iteration of the same network. What was classified as a non-actionable report at the time is being reevaluated. She was very still. What does reevaluation mean? It means that the conclusion that the report was inconclusive, the administrative decision that ended your position, is being reconsidered in light of the current evidence. He said it carefully with the precision of someone who wanted to be accurate and not overpromise. It won't undo what happened, but it means the record is going to reflect that you were right about what you saw. 6 years ago, to report about a supply discrepancy in a context she hadn't been able to fully identify. And the report had been buried, and she'd been removed, and she'd rebuilt her life in a city she'd chosen partly by process of elimination. She'd spent 6 years knowing she'd seen something real and had nothing to show for it except a sealed file and a nursing license. She was going to have something to show for it now. She didn't perform anything about that. It wasn't the kind of thing she performed. She just stood with it for a moment. The way you stand with heavy things when you've been carrying them long enough that putting them down takes a second to register. Thank you, she said, for making the calls. You were right about the dog, he said. 17 minutes into the situation, and you were the only person in that room who saw it correctly. I should have listened earlier. He paused. I'm trying to build a record of listening earlier. She understood that this was as close as he was going to get to saying something personal, and she received it in the spirit it was offered. Listened. When it mattered, she said, that counts. Nodded once, extended his hand. She shook it, and it was the handshake of two people who had established, through a very specific kind of trial, that they trusted each other's judgment in situations where judgment was the only currency that worked. She watched him go. Then she picked up her bag and walked out of Redwood Mercy Medical Center into the evening, which was doing the thing it did in October in Boise, cooling fast after a warm day, going Osweiss and orange, and she drove home to her apartment. The ceremony for Aldrich Voss was on a Saturday in late autumn, at the installation that had been his home post, and Mara drove 3 hours to be there. She had not been invited officially, been told by Cross that she was welcome to attend, and she'd decided that welcome to attend was sufficient. She wore civilian clothes and stood at the back of the assembled group, which was larger than she'd expected, which meant more people had loved him than the sparse transfer documentation had implied. And she watched the proceedings with the particular attention of someone who is trying to honor something properly. The full honors were complete: the flag, the salute, the commendation read aloud with the actual words of it instead of the redacted version that had followed him through the system's failure to protect him. The commendation cited his report, the one that had been buried and then recovered, and named it explicitly as an act of courage that had contributed to the exposure of a criminal network operating against the interests of the service members it had been contracted to support. He was 31 years old. He deserved a life that was larger than the one he got. The record of what he'd done was accurate now, and accurate records were what outlasted everything else. Afterward, a woman found her at the edge of the assembled group, in her 60s, with the composed expression of someone who had done a great deal of grieving, and was not finished, but had decided to be present anyway. She looked at Mara the way people look at someone they've formed a picture of and are now adjusting. The nurse, she said. Yes, ma'am, Aldrich's colleague from Jagge the colonel, he said, you have the dog. I do. The woman Voss's mother, though she hadn't said so, because she didn't need to look at her for a long moment. He talked about that dog like he was a person, she said. Every call home, Decker did this. Decker figured out that. He was a partner, she paused. He was the best thing in Aldrich's service, he said. The best part of the work. Mara didn't trust herself to say anything complicated. He's a good dog, she said. She stopped. Really, his paw is healed, Mara said. He eats too fast and he's decided the rug by the window belongs to him, and he doesn't like the sound of the neighbor's truck, but he's working through it. She paused. He's okay, really. The woman looked at her for another moment. Then she reached out and put her hand briefly on Mara's arm. Not a hug, not a prolonged thing. Just a touch that communicated the full weight of what she was feeling in the most compressed possible form. Thank you, she said, for taking care of him. It's mutual, Mara said, and meant it. The official recognition came in November, 6 weeks after the ceremony, in the form of a letter on formal military stationery with a case reference number that was not sealed, that was in fact the exact opposite of sealed, being a matter of record that anyone with appropriate clearance could access. Letter acknowledged her contribution to the federal investigation, her role in preserving the evidence chain, and her assistance in the identification of the prior operational connection. It used language that was careful and formal and said between every line that the people writing it understood what 7 years of quiet service or a forced silence was worth and were making an attempt to say so. At the bottom of the letter was a separate enclosure. It was a proposal formal considered, with the architectural structure of something that had been discussed by multiple parties before being put on paper. It proposed the creation of a specialized protocol for the handling of injured military working dogs during medical transfers through civilian facilities. The protocol would establish training requirements for civilian trauma staff, handling guidelines derived from the techniques she'd used with Decker, and a formalized liaison structure between military K-9 units and civilian medical centers to prevent the kind of situation that had placed a blind working dog and a body bag in a civilian trauma bay with no appropriate support. It had her name on it, not as the subject of the proposal, as the author. They were asking her to write it. To turn what she'd done in the trauma bay and the supply room and the East Corridor into a standard that would change how it happened the next time. Not erase the next time, because there would always be a next time, but shape it. Give the next nurse who encountered a military dog in crisis something to reach for that wasn't just instinct and a sealed record. She sat at her kitchen table with the letter and the enclosure, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold because she'd been reading for longer than she'd meant to. Baker was on the rug by the window. Afternoon. Light came through at the angle. It always came through in November, going pale and low, and it landed on him in the way that light lands on sleeping dogs, which is one of the more honest things light does. He was on his side. Feet extended, the complete physical relaxation of something that had decided this was a safe place. He'd been having the dream was. She didn't know what the dream was, but she recognized it, the twitching, the muffled sounds, the way his breathing changed, and she'd learned that the right response was to say his name once quietly, let him surface on his own, rather than pulling him out. He surfaced better that way. He seemed to understand that she'd be there when he came up. The tags from his old harness were on the shelf near the window where she'd put them the day after the formal adoption papers came through. She'd bought him a new harness, same style, properly fitted, and transferred his own tags to it. His tags. She'd kept on the shelf because they'd been there in that harness through every moment of what Decker had survived, and they had their own form of belonging there. She looked at the tags, looked at the letter, looked at the dog. She'd spent 6 years in this city, being the person who'd given up one thing and built another in its place and was careful about the difference. She'd been careful about her scope, about her visibility, about the line between her old competence and her current role. She'd told herself this was pragmatism. Maybe some of it was. Maybe some of it was fear, and fear is a reasonable response to having been burned, and she was not going to diminish it by pretending it hadn't been there. The line she'd drawn around herself hadn't protected her in the end. It had just made her smaller. The thing that had actually mattered in the trauma bay, in the annex, in the dark corridor with a scent trail and a dog who knew which way to go was the full version of her, not the curated version, not the unremarkable personnel file. Accumulated, imperfect, operationally specific. 7 years in a trauma bay person who could read a dog's body language and a gurney tag and a circuit panel and a set of footsteps and understand what they all meant together. Right. You couldn't do that by halves. You couldn't be useful to a situation like that one by deciding in advance how much of yourself to bring. She picked up a pen. She started writing out the protocol that would take weeks. Consultation input from people who knew the military K9 system better than she remembered it. From 6 years ago, coordination with Ferris and probably Cross and a program coordinator she hadn't met yet. It would take time and it would be complicated and parts of it would be wrong on the first draft and she'd fix them. That was how things got built correctly. What she wrote first was simpler. It was a letter to Voss's mother, because she'd thought about the conversation at the ceremony every day since. And there were things she'd wanted to say that the conversation had been too compressed to hold. She wrote about the trauma bay, not the operational details, just what it had looked like. The specific image of a dog who refused to leave, who decided that staying was the only thing left that meant something. She wrote about what that kind of loyalty looked like from the outside and what it suggested about the person who'd earned it. She wrote that Decker was on the rug by the window in the afternoon light and had eaten his dinner in about 45 seconds and had that morning figured out how to open the cabinet where she kept the spare leashes, which she was choosing to interpret as ambition rather than misbehavior. She wrote that she thought Aldrich Voss had understood something that took most people longer, that the people worth standing for don't always have a voice in the room. The ones who need advocating for are often the ones who've been told their word doesn't count, their concern is outside their scope, their record doesn't warrant the consideration. Doing the right thing in those situations is not a smooth or rewarded experience. It is usually inconvenient and often costly, and it happens anyway because the alternative is knowing you didn't. She wrote that the things she'd learned in the supply room and the corridor and the annex in the 7 years before all of it was that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you believe it. If you don't believe it, if you stay clear about what you know and what you can do and what you're willing to do with it, then other people's low assessment of you is just noise. Full noise sometimes. Noise that has real consequences sometimes. Noise. She looked at what she'd written. It was not a polished letter. It had a correction in the third paragraph and a sentence that ran too long and a word she'd chosen wrong and crossed out. She was going to send it anyway because the correct version and the honest version were not always the same thing, and Voss's mother deserved the honest one. Made the sound he made, sometimes when he was sleeping well. Not the twitching sound, the other one lower, almost a murmur. She'd decided it was contentment, which was possibly anthropomorphic and was also, she thought, probably accurate. Fine. She sealed the letter, set it aside, picked up the protocol proposal, and capped the pen again. At the top of the first page, she wrote her name, her full name, not the careful civilian version, but the full professional designation, all of it. And she wrote it clearly, the way you write something you're not trying to hide. Outside the window, the evening came down over Boise in the way it had come down every evening for 7 years, which was the same as always, and also tonight, slightly different. Decker's ear turned toward the window, toward the sound of the city, the ordinary sound of a place that did not know what had happened inside one of its hospitals 6 weeks ago and was simply going about the business of being alive, which was a thing it did regardless, which was the right thing to do. He listened for a moment, assessed, decided. It was nothing that required action. Put his head back down. Mara bent over the proposal and began to write. She had work to do, real work, the kind that outlasted the crisis and didn't resolve neatly and mattered anyway. She had a conversation with Claudette that was ongoing, and a protocol that needed building and testimony that Tildy to be given, and a dog who needed his morning walk before he decided the cabinet situation required further exploration. She had a record that was no longer sealed in the wrong direction. She had a name that meant something again, not because anyone had given it back to her, but because she'd never actually let go of it. She had not arrived here smoothly. She had not done anything in the last 6 weeks without making at least one mistake. Second, guessing at least one decision, running out of energy at least one moment when she'd needed more of it. That was not a failure of character. That was just the texture of doing hard things, which people rarely told you about in advance, and which you figured out by doing them anyway. The protocol would not be perfect. The investigation would take longer than it should. The people who'd been harmed by what Velt Caro had done would carry it beyond the resolution of the case. Because that was how harm worked. It didn't end when the paperwork did. These were real things, and she held them clearly, and Decker was on the rug by the window, his handler's tags on the shelf above him, breathing in the easy rhythm of an animal that had been given after everything a place to rest. That was also a real thing. She held that one too.